Hello beautiful people. Welcome to Beyond Hogwarts. In today's episode, we explore, what if Artemis was Harry's mother instead of Lily and Goddess raised him as immortal hunter of dark wizards? Hit like, subscribe, and join our community of story lovers. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Moon's Child. The Owl Never Came. That was the first sign that something was different about the night Voldemort died, or didn't die, depending on how you counted. No owl streaked across the sky toward Arabella Figg's house, no message tied to a trembling leg, no breathless witch or wizard operating onto Privet Drive with tears streaming down their face. The celebrations that erupted across the wizarding world that Halloween night happened without a single person stopping to ask a very simple, very important question. Where was the boy? Hagrid knew there had been a boy. He'd been sent to fetch him, after all, half-giant frame folded into a flying motorcycle borrowed from a young Auror named Sirius Black, the engine growling through clouds while below, the wizarding world lit candles and set off sparks and wept with relief. He'd landed in Godric's Hollow just after midnight, picked his way through the rubble of what had been a cheerful little cottage, and found the nursery. The crib was empty. Not smashed, not burned, not collapsed under fallen ceiling beams. Just empty, with a small indent in the blanket where a baby had been lying, and a single silver feather resting in the center of that indent, long and luminous and utterly impossible, since no bird native to Britain had ever produced a feather quite that color or quite that light. Hagrid had stood there for a long time, holding the feather, and then he'd sat down on a piece of rubble and cried, because Hagrid always cried when things were sad, and a missing baby felt very sad indeed. Dumbledore arrived 20 minutes later. He looked at the feather for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up at the moon, full, silver, blazing, and his expression shifted into something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite the calculating look he sometimes wore when pieces of a very large puzzle moved in unexpected directions. It was something in between all three. "Ah," he said quietly. "Just that. Ah." He folded the feather into his robes and never spoke of it publicly. The forest didn't have a name. It existed in the space between places, the thin margin between the mortal world and something older, the kind of wilderness that appeared on no map because maps were human things and this forest predated humans by several geological ages. Trees here were older than language. The undergrowth moved with its own slow intelligence. At night, the moonlight came down through the canopy in shafts of pure silver, and the animals that moved through it did so quietly and with great dignity, as though they understood they were living in a sacred place. Harry had grown up here. His earliest memory, not reconstructed, not told to him, but genuinely his, the kind that lived in the body rather than the mind, was of lying in a patch of moonlight while something warm and bright leaned over him. Two silver eyes, vast and knowing. A hand that was both a woman's hand and somehow more than that, pressing lightly against his forehead. "You will be many things," a voice had said, low and resonant as a hunting horn across still water. "But you will always be mine first." He'd been maybe 3 months old. He shouldn't have remembered it. He remembered it perfectly. Growing up with Artemis was not, it should be said, a conventional childhood. There were no birthday cakes with tricked candles. No scrape-knee kisses or bedtime stories about friendly dragons. What there was this: at age 3, Harry could track a white deer through 6 miles of old-growth forest by scent alone. At 5, he could string a hunting bow that most grown men couldn't have drawn. At 7, Artemis had taken him to the top of a mountain in what the mortals called Greece and told him to find his way back to the forest alone, with nothing but a knife and the stars. He'd been back in 4 days. She'd been waiting at the tree line, silver eyes bright, and she hadn't hugged him or praised him. She'd looked him over the way a general inspects a soldier, critically, clinically, checking for wounds, and then she'd said, 3 days next time, and turned back into the forest. Harry had grinned so hard his face hurt. That was how she loved him. Not softly, not with words, or not with many words, but with the constant insistence that he was capable of more than he knew, that the world would test him and she intended him to pass every test it offered. When he fell, she let him get up himself. When he failed, she made him try again. When he succeeded, the look on her face was worth more than any amount of praise from anyone else. He learned other things too, naturally, in between the tracking and the archery and the survival training. Chiron came twice a year, the centaur moving through the forest with the patient ease of someone who had been teaching young heroes since before Rome was a village, and from Chiron he got mathematics and history and literature and astronomy. Artemis herself taught him languages, not just English and Greek and Latin but the older tongues, the ones spoken by mountains and rivers and things that had no interest in human classification. He learned the language of wolves from an actual wolf, which was a more effective teaching method than any classroom. And then there was the magic. It had shown up early, the way it apparently always did with wizarding children, a pot on the fire that levitated itself when Harry had wanted hot chocolate at age 4, a branch of a tree that bent itself down to his reaching hand. But the magic that emerged from Harry was not quite the magic that emerged from ordinary wizarding children, because Harry was not quite an ordinary wizarding child. When it sparked from his hands in those early years it was silver. Not pale yellow like sunlight, not the bright white of a standard lumos, not any of the colors that characterize typical magical discharge. Pure silver, the color of moonlight and arrow shafts and still water at midnight. Artemis had watched the first time it happened, a burst of silver light that knocked a charging boar sideways when Harry was 6, the animal crashing into a tree while Harry stood breathing hard, hands still raised, and her expression had been unreadable for a long moment. Then she'd knelt in front of him, which she did rarely, putting herself at eye level. "You know what you are," she'd said. It wasn't a question. "Your son," Harry had said. "More than that. Half God. Half divine," she'd corrected. "The other half is your father's. Both of them matter. Neither of them makes you less than what you are." She'd looked at his still glowing hands. "That magic, the wizard magic, it will want training. Proper training. There are schools. You're going to send me away?" She'd looked at him for a long moment, and he'd seen something move through her silver eyes that might, in a mortal woman, have been the precursor to tears. Artemis, to his knowledge, did not cry. But something moved in her eyes. "Not yet," she'd said. "Not yet." He was 7. She kept him 4 more years. In those 4 years she taught him everything she knew about fighting, real fighting, the kind that decided whether you lived or died, not the sporting kind that awarded points for elegance. She taught him that the first rule of any conflict was to understand your enemy more completely than they understood themselves. She taught him that speed beat strength, that terrain was a weapon, that patience was not passivity. She put a bow in his hand until it felt like an extension of his arm, and she taught him what she called the 3 knowledges, the knowledge of when to strike, the knowledge of when to wait, and, harder than either, the knowledge of when to walk away. Some hunts, she told him one evening, the 2 of them sitting by a fire while the forest breathed softly around them, are not yours to complete. Some quarry belongs to someone else's story. The hardest discipline is recognizing which is which. "How do you know?" Harry had asked. She'd been quiet for a moment, poking the fire with a stick, silver hair loose around her shoulders. She looked, in these unguarded moments, like a very young woman, though Harry understood that the concept of age didn't quite apply to her in the usual way. "You feel it in your chest," she said finally. "Here." She pressed her knuckles briefly to her sternum. "When a hunt is yours, it pulls. Like a compass needle. Like gravity. You'll learn to tell the difference." He thought about that for a long time afterward. On the evening before his 11th birthday, Artemis sat across from him at the fire and looked at him the way she sometimes looked at the moon, with something in her expression that was both possessive and resigned, like a person watching a tide go out that they know will return but cannot stop from missing. "The school," she said. "It's time." Harry had been expecting it. He nodded once, and the fire cracked between them. "You were born in the wizarding world," she said. "Part of you belongs to it. That world is," she paused, searching for a word that didn't taste like compromise, "complicated. They have their own ways, their own hierarchies, their own ideas about what magic is and who gets to use it and how. Her eyes met his. Most of those ideas are wrong. I know. You have a history there. People who knew your father. People who have been watching for you. Her expression sharpened slightly. A man named Albus Dumbledore. He is clever. He has spent 10 years wondering where you are. When you appear, he will try to understand you, and when he can't, he will try to manage you instead. Do not allow it. And Voldemort? Harry asked. He said the name without any difficulty, the same way he said wolf or storm, something that required respect and appropriate preparation, not fear. Artemis's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He is your hunt, she said, and there was something in those 4 words, an acknowledgement, a bestowing, a thing with weight, that settled over Harry like a cloak. But he is not finished yet. Not yet. You'll know when. She reached across the fire then, something she did rarely, physical contact was not her primary language, and pressed 2 fingers to the scar on his forehead. The lightning bolt had faded over the years from angry red to pale silver, the same shade as his magic, and under her touch it glowed briefly before going quiet. I am always with you, she said. When you look at the moon, when you are in the wild, when you track something in the dark and your blood goes quiet and everything in you aligns, that is me. That is always me. I know, Harry said, and his voice was steady, because she had raised him to be steady. But his eyes were very bright. Diagon Alley in the morning was chaos the way rivers were chaos, purposeful, noisy, going somewhere, not particularly interested in your opinion about it. Harry walked through it with his hands in his pockets and his eyes moving, taking in the flow of people the way Artemis had taught him to read terrain. Apothecaries and robed shops and the smell of ink and parchment and something that might have been dragon hide being cured in a back room somewhere. Witches in pointed hats arguing over the price of beetle eyes. A pair of wizards debating loudly whether the Chudley Cannons had any realistic chance this season, which, based on the passion in their voices, they clearly did not. A cart overloaded with cages full of owls that were registering their opinions on being stacked 5 high. He'd come alone, because Artemis felt that Diagon Alley did not require a goddess's oversight, and because Harry at 11 was more capable of navigating a strange environment than most adults gave children credit for. He had a list, parchment, quills, textbooks, robes, a cauldron, and Gringotts at the top of the alley, which apparently held an account his father had established before Harry was born. Gringotts was exactly the kind of institution Harry found satisfying, organized, cold, direct, with no interest in pretense. The goblin at the main desk looked him over when he presented the key, a small, silver-chased thing that Artemis had kept and pressed into his hand the night before, with an expression that goblins wore when they were calculating something they didn't intend to share. Potter, the goblin said. Yes. The goblin looked at him again. At his eyes, which were green, James Potter's green, vivid as spring leaves, and at the scar on his forehead, and at something else, something that wasn't visible in the usual sense but that beings with sufficiently long memories could sometimes detect in people who carried divine blood, the way old wood carries the ghost of the tree. The account has been dormant for 10 years, the goblin said. I know. I'll need to make a withdrawal. The cart ride down was spectacular. Harry rode it with his face into the wind and his eyes open, watching the dark walls blur past, feeling the pull and drop of the turns in his stomach the way he felt the ground under his feet when he ran, with pleasure, with attention, with the simple animal enjoyment of speed. He came back up with enough gold to last him through the school year and then some, and made his way through the alley with efficient purpose, checking items off the list as he went. Robes from Madame Malkin's, fitted, plain, no embellishment, which earned him a slightly baffled look from Madame Malkin herself, who was accustomed to mothers fussing over hem lengths. Parchment and quills and ink. Standard cauldron, pewter, size 2. The brass scales. He was in flourish and blots, working through a shelf of second-hand texts to find the additions on his list, when a girl appeared at his elbow. She was roughly his age, with a great deal of brown hair that looked like it had lost an argument with itself, and she was carrying approximately 4 books more than any reasonable person needed. She was also reading while walking, which Harry recognized as either a sign of exceptional spatial awareness or impending collision. "That one's different from the current edition," she said, not looking up from her own book. Harry looked at the textbook in his hand. "The Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1. Different how?" Chapter 6. She looked up then, blinking as though slightly surprised to find herself speaking to an actual person. Her eyes were brown and very sharp. The current edition corrected the wand movement for Wingardium Leviosa. The older one has a slight error that makes the levitation unstable past about 3 feet. Doesn't matter much in first year, but it's a bad habit to establish. She paused. "I've read both." "You've already been in here long enough to read 2 editions of the same textbook." "I've been here 3 times this week." She said it without embarrassment, as a simple fact. "I'm Hermione Granger. My parents are dentists, muggles, so I've been trying to read everything I can before term starts. There's a lot to catch up on." "Harry," he said. She looked at him properly then, and her gaze moved to his forehead, not to the scar, but to something in his face, some quality of attention she'd registered without quite knowing why. "You have very still eyes," she said, and then looked mildly embarrassed. "Sorry, that's odd. I just mean, most people's eyes move around a lot, especially in a new place, but yours," she stopped. "Are you Harry Potter?" The scar was partially covered by his fringe, not because he was hiding it but because he simply wore his hair the way it fell, which was in every direction simultaneously, a quality he'd inherited from James. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has prepared extensively for a thing and is now discovering the preparation didn't quite account for the reality. "Oh," she said. "I've read about you." "Well, there isn't much written about you specifically, not in any reliable source, but there's a great deal about the night Voldemort died. Or dispersed. Unclear." She blinked. "Most people don't say his name. Most people are afraid of it. I'm not." He looked at the corrected edition she'd recommended. "Thanks for this." He exchanged the books. "What year are you in?" "First. Hogwarts letter came last month." The excitement in her voice was not performed, it was the genuine, barely contained excitement of someone who has found the door to a world she'd suspected existed. "You. First." He added the corrected textbook to his basket. "The book on Transfiguration, do you know if the foundational theory has changed between editions?" Her face lit up the way it does when you hand someone their favorite topic, and she launched into a precise, detailed, surprisingly entertaining summary of McGonagall's theoretical revisions to the Statute of Shape, and Harry listened with genuine interest, and by the time they left the shop they were walking together as though it had been decided, which in a way it had. The Hogwarts Express was loud and warm and smelled of pumpkin pasties and the particular animal smell of students who had been traveling for hours in an enclosed space. Harry found a compartment near the back and sat with his back to the wall and his face to the door, because Artemis had been very clear on the subject of strategic seating, and watched the countryside unspool beyond the window as England went from city to suburb to open country to something that felt more like wilderness. Hermione appeared in the doorway 20 minutes after the train left King's Cross, preceded by a round-faced boy with terrified eyes and a frog he was clearly pretending he hadn't lost. "Have you seen a toad?" she asked the car at large. "Neville's lost his. He went under the seat," Harry said, pointing. The frog, Trevor, apparently, was retrieved. Neville looked like he was deciding whether to be grateful or mortified, landed on grateful, and sat down. Hermione sat across from Harry and opened the book she'd been reading on the platform, and the 4 of them, Harry, Hermione, Neville, and a red-haired boy who appeared halfway through the journey and introduced himself as Ron Weasley in the tone of someone who expects a particular kind of reaction, made it to Scotland in reasonable comfort. Ron had clearly been briefed about Harry Potter, the legend. Harry could tell by the slight widening of the eyes, the way Ron's gaze went immediately to the forehead. What Ron had clearly not been briefed about was Harry Potter, the actual person, the version who looked back at you with calm, unreadable green eyes and asked sensible questions and laughed at the right moments and was sitting in a posture that said, without any aggression, I know where everything in this room is. Ron sat across from him and tried the measure him up assessment that 11-year-old boys do when they meet someone they're not sure what to make of, and Harry let it happen with the easy patience of someone who had been measured before and found it more amusing than threatening. So where've you been? Ron asked, somewhere past Newcastle. Everyone reckoned you'd be raised by your mum's sister, but she said she hadn't heard from you, and no one knew. I was raised by my mother, Harry said. But Lily Potter, my mother, Harry said, and there was a quiet finality in it that Ron, who had good instincts, recognized as a closed door and didn't push. The castle appeared out of the storm-dark sky as the boats crossed the lake, and Harry stood at the prow of one of them and looked up at Hogwarts, turrets and towers and lit windows against the black sky, the lake reflecting it in broken silver, and felt, for the first time, something that wasn't quite recognition but was adjacent to it. Like a place he'd heard described and was now finding true to its description. It has power, he thought. Old power, different from the forests, but real. Something under the castle felt wrong, though. Faint, muffled through layers of stone and the ambient magic of the school itself, but there, the way a predator could feel a trail had gone cold without quite being able to say how they knew. Something beneath the ground, something contained, something watched. He filled it away. He would think about it later. The sorting hat was ancient and tired-looking and apparently sentient, which Harry found interesting. It sat on a stool at the front of the great hall and was placed on each student's head in turn, and the other students had been appropriately anxious about this process in ways that Harry found slightly baffling. It was a hat, the worst outcome was a decision he disagreed with, and decisions could always be argued. He watched the sorting with attention. Hermione went to Gryffindor and looked faintly triumphant, the expression of someone whose research had led them to a correct prediction. Neville went to Gryffindor too, to his visible astonishment. Ron went to Gryffindor, another Weasley, the hat called, with what sounded like faint exhaustion, and punched the air. Then his name. The hall went quiet in the specific way that it goes quiet when everyone in it has had the same thought simultaneously. He walked to the stool with his hands at his sides and sat down, and the hat dropped over his eyes, and he was in the dark. Well, said a voice inside his head. It sounded like old parchment, like a library late at night. This is unexpected. I get that a lot, Harry thought back. You have. The hat went quiet for a moment, the way a person goes quiet when they've opened a door and found something they didn't anticipate. There's something in you that isn't quite, you're not entirely, I know what I am, Harry said. You're trying to sort me. Do that. Courage, the hat said slowly, as if working through a list. Yes, considerable. Loyalty, conditional but deep. Intelligence, sharp, practical, excellent pattern recognition. Ambition, another pause. Not the self-advancing kind. But ambition nonetheless. You want things, boy. You want them with the kind of clarity most people spend their whole lives developing. So the question isn't which house deserves your qualities, the hat said, and its voice had shifted from the tone of an assessor to something more like an equal. The question is, in 10 years, what do you want to have done? What kind of person do you want to have built? Harry thought about that for exactly 3 seconds. One Voldemort is dead, he thought. Or something close to it. More will come. They always do. I want to be where the best strategy for dismantling all of them begins. Then you already know, the hat said. Gryffindor. The table erupted. Harry lifted the hat from his head, set it back on the stool with a nod that was something between courtesy and acknowledgement, and walked to the red and gold table. He sat across from Hermione, who pushed the dish of roast potatoes toward him without preamble, and he accepted them, and that was more or less decided. He looked up at the staff table as he ate. The teachers were easy enough to read, the way people always were when you've been trained to look past the surface: nervousness, intelligence, political wariness, genuine excitement, bureaucratic exhaustion. A small woman with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes who held herself like someone accustomed to being the most capable person in a room. A man with a purple turban and a nervous tick around his left eye that was not the natural kind. At the center, Dumbledore. Old and watchful and brilliant behind the half-moon glasses, with the particular energy of a man who had expected something and was recalibrating in real time. His eyes found Harry's almost immediately, the instinct of an intelligent man moving toward an anomaly, and held there for a beat. Harry looked back at him without looking away. After a moment, Dumbledore smiled slightly, and it was genuinely warm, and Harry recognized this because Artemis had been very clear about teaching him to recognize it. It was the smile of a man who had just decided you were interesting. That, Harry thought, is the more dangerous of the two reactions. Quirrell, the name had come from a brief conversation with a knowing ghost who drifted past the table during the feast, kept glancing at him. Not curiously, not assessingly, but in the way a mouse glances at a hawk, compulsively, unable to stop, wanting to know if the trajectory had changed. Harry ate his food and watched the candles floating overhead and let his attention drop, like water through stone, to the something wrong beneath the castle. It was down there, patient and waiting, like an animal that doesn't know yet it's been found. Soon, he thought, not quite conscious of thinking it. But not yet. After dinner, as the first years filed up toward Gryffindor Tower behind a prefect named Percy who used the word protocol 4 times in the space of 3 sentences, Harry fell into step beside Hermione. Around them, the castle breathed, staircases shifting, portraits murmuring, the particular low thrum of old stone saturated with a century of magic. "What do you make of it?" he asked her quietly. She looked around, and her expression was the one he was already beginning to recognize as her absorbing look, cataloging, cross-referencing, weighing against the enormous library she'd apparently been building in her head since the letter arrived. "It's extraordinary," she said. "The ambient magic in the walls alone must be, there are enchantments layered over enchantments in here, some of them centuries old. I could spend a year just mapping the ward structure." "Something's off, though," Harry said. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "In the ground. Under the school. There's something there that doesn't belong." He paused. "Or does belong and shouldn't." Hermione frowned with the specific focus of someone presented with a puzzle. "Under the school. There are dungeons, obviously, and beyond that, I read about Hogwarts' sublevels in Hogwarts, a history, but there's no mention of anything." She stopped. Her eyes changed, the way they did when something clicked. "You can feel it?" "When I'm paying attention." She was quiet for 3 steps. "I believe you," she said, which was not the first thing most people said when an 11-year-old claimed to be able to sense something through stone floors, but Hermione Granger had read enough to know that dismissing strange information because it was strange was how people missed important things. "Good," he said. "I'll need to think about it." She said. "We'll need to think about it." He looked at her sideways. She was looking straight ahead, small chin set in the way that meant a decision had been made. Harry felt something loosen slightly in his chest. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, the slight thaw of a person who had been raised to be self-sufficient encountering, for the first time in memory, someone who said "we" like they meant it. He didn't say anything. But he kept pace with her up the shifting staircase, and that was enough. The dormitory was quiet when the other boys finally fell asleep, Neville at an almost comically immediate hour, Ron after a brief summary of every piece of information he had about Hogwarts that he seemed to feel Harry couldn't function without, and a boy named Dean Thomas who was interesting and observant in ways Harry suspected he'd appreciate later. Harry lay on top of his blankets with his eyes open and listened to the castle settle. From here, the forest was visible through the window, the forbidden forest, though the prohibition had made approximately no impression on him, dark and breathing on the far side of the grounds, the tree line a ragged edge against the less dark sky. The moon was up. Almost full, the silver light falling through the glass onto the stone floor. He thought about Artemis. Not with sadness, she'd be watching the same moon somewhere, in the forest or on the mountain or in the between places she moved through, but with the particular awareness of her that lived in him always, the compass needle pull of belonging. "I know what I'm doing," he told her, inside his head, the way he'd learned to talk to her across distance. Roughly. There was no audible response. There never was, from this distance, with the castle's wards in the way. But the moonlight shifted slightly, intensifying for one brief moment to something that was not quite natural, and Harry took that for the acknowledgement it was. He sat up and pulled his knees to his chest and thought about the something beneath the school, running it through the logic she'd built in him. What do you know? What do you not know? What does the thing behave like? What does it want? He didn't have enough yet. That was fine. He was patient. He had been taught by someone to whom decades were reasonable waiting periods. But he was here now. He was in the castle, and the hunt, small, preliminary, not yet named, was beginning. He looked out at the dark forest for a long moment. Then he lay back down, folded his hands on his chest, closed his eyes, and went to sleep. Chapter 2, The Sorting of Something Ancient. The first week of classes established several things very quickly. Professor McGonagall taught transfiguration with the energy of someone who had been doing this for 40 years and still found incompetence personally offensive. She turned her desk into a pig on the first morning, turned it back again, and looked around the room with an expression that dared anyone to be unimpressed. Harry was impressed, genuinely, the precision of it, the economy of motion, the way she didn't perform the magic so much as direct it, like a general pointing at a battlefield and having it rearrange itself. He filed that away. Charms with Professor Flitwick was structured and clear, and Flitwick himself was enthusiastic in the infectious way of someone who had never lost their sense of wonder about their subject. Astronomy at midnight was simply pleasant. The night sky from a castle tower was a different thing than the night sky from a forest clearing, more framed, more architectural, but the stars were the same stars Harry had navigated by since he was 7, and their familiarity was grounding. History of magic was a ghost droning in a monotone about goblin rebellions, which Harry endured by using the time to mentally map the sections of the castle he'd already walked. Potions was Snape. He swept in like weather, black robes, black eyes, and the absolute conviction of a man who knows he is the most technically proficient person in the room and has mixed feelings about that being true among 11-year-olds. He paused at the front of the classroom and let the silence do work before he started speaking, which Harry recognized as a technique. Effective, but transparent. "Potter," Snape said, 10 minutes into the lesson, in the tone of a man picking up a test. "What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" Harry looked up from the notebook where he'd been sketching the outline of the castle's lower levels from memory. "Draught of living death," he said. "One of the most powerful sleeping potions known. The name comes from the asphodel's associations with the underworld in Greek tradition. Technically the flower grew in the meadows where the neutral dead wandered, so the name has a slightly ironic quality, since it doesn't kill so much as suspend." A beat of silence. "Where did you find bezoars?" Snape continued, as though Harry hadn't just answered correctly, and added context. "Stomach of a goat. Acts as a general antidote for most poisons. Limited effectiveness against anything brewed with lacewing flies or anything with a magical base component, though, the catalytic magic overwhelms the bezoar's buffering property." Another silence, this one with a different texture. "And what is the difference," Snape said, very precisely, "between monkshood and wolfsbane?" "They're the same plant," Harry said. "Also called aconite. Different names in different traditions, monkshood from the shape of the flowers, wolfsbane from the old folk belief that it repelled werewolves, which is partially true in that ingestion causes severe distress in lycanthropes specifically. The active compound interacts differently with the transformed physiology." Snape looked at him. It was not a warm look. Snape's looks were rarely warm, but it was the look of a man who has encountered something he didn't fully anticipate, and who is deciding what to do with that. 5 points to Gryffindor, he said, clipping it short, and moved on to the next question. Hermione, sitting next to Harry, leaned over and whispered, "He asked those questions to humiliate people. That's not on any of the standard reading." "I know," Harry said quietly. My mother had a fairly comprehensive herbal library. After class, walking back up from the dungeons, she asked, "How did you know about the lycanthrope interaction?" "I've met werewolves," Harry said. "In the forest." She stared at him. "They were perfectly polite," he added. "Once we established that I wasn't prey." Flying lessons happened on the Thursday of the first week, which meant Harry had spent 3 days watching Draco Malfoy operate and had formed a reasonably complete picture. Malfoy was intelligent, genuinely, not performatively. He had good instincts and a quick mind and the particular social fluency of someone raised in a politically sophisticated household. He was also, as near as Harry could tell, operating almost entirely on the assumption that being a Malfoy meant he was owed a particular position in any room he walked into, and that assumption had gone unchallenged for long enough that he'd stopped checking whether it was true. Harry found him interesting the way he found lots of things interesting, as a puzzle, as a phenomenon to understand. He didn't find him threatening. He suspected Malfoy was amused to people who didn't find him at least slightly threatening. The broomsticks were lined up on the grass in the pale autumn sunshine, and Madame Hooch walked the class through the command to summon them from the ground, and Neville's broom shot up and hit him in the face, and Madame Hooch was still addressing that situation when Malfoy picked up Neville's remembrall, which had rolled away during the collision, and held it up. "Better not let the big babies play with things, they'll just lose," he said, to Crabbe and Goyle, who laughed on schedule. Harry had been watching this. He was watching Neville now, the flush of humiliation, the set of his jaw that said he wanted to do something and had already decided he wasn't capable, and he was watching Malfoy with the specific quality of attention you gave to something that needed addressing before it became a habit. "Put it down," Harry said. Malfoy turned. He'd been waiting, Harry realized, waiting to see what the famous Harry Potter would do with this situation, whether he'd be the kind of person you could push or the kind you couldn't. "Excuse me," Malfoy said, with the particular inflection of someone who knows the script says "Are you serious?" but is also genuinely curious about the answer. "The remembrall," Harry said pleasantly. "Put it down." Malfoy looked at him. The broom was in his other hand now, and something in him, that good instinct Harry had noted, took a reading, the way animals take readings, the kind that happens faster than thought. For just a moment, something flickered in his grey eyes. Then the performance reasserted itself. "Or what, Potter?" "You'll," Harry had already walked forward, 3 steps, easy and unhurried, and taken the remembrall from Malfoy's hand. Not snatched, taken, calmly, with the casual certainty of someone who had already decided how this was going to go. He set it on Neville's palm without looking away from Malfoy. "I don't make threats," Harry said, quietly enough that it didn't carry to the whole class. "I find them inefficient." He tilted his head slightly. "You have good instincts. The first read you took of me," he paused, "was right. Trust that more." Malfoy stared at him. His mouth opened slightly and closed again. Crabbe and Goyle looked confused, which appeared to be their default state. Madame Hooch finished with Neville and called the class to attention, and the moment broke, and everyone mounted their brooms and kicked off, and Harry let the wind take him up into the cold October air and the thing passed. Later, after class, Malfoy fell into step beside him crossing the courtyard, not in the companionable way but in the deliberate way, the way of someone who wants to continue something. "You're strange, Potter," he said. It came out like it was meant to be an insult and arrived somewhere else. "Yes," Harry agreed. "Everyone said you'd be," Malfoy stopped. "What everyone said is based on a story," Harry said. "The story is mostly wrong." Malfoy was quiet for a moment. "My father says Dumbledore's been looking for you for 10 years. "I know. He couldn't find you." "No. Where were you?" Harry looked at him sideways, and something in his expression, the absolute calm of it, the absence of any defensive energy, made Malfoy blink. "The forest," Harry said, and walked on. The thing under the castle was becoming clearer. It had taken Harry 2 weeks to map it properly, not the physical geography, which was relatively simple to infer from the architecture above, but the magical geography, the shape of what was being contained and how and why. He'd taken to walking the castle late at night, which the portraits found scandalous and which Peeves seemed to find either entertaining or unsettling. It was hard to tell with Peeves. The wards under the school were layered in a way that spoke of both anxiety and expertise. Someone with significant skill had put something significant down there and wanted it significantly not found. Multiple enchantments, some of them old enough to suggest the thing had been here since before the current school year started. Not native to the castle. Installed. 3rd floor corridor. East wing. The door at the end was held shut by what felt like an Allohammer-proof lock and also something else, something with teeth, metaphorically, something that said this is not a deterrent, this is a warning. He stood in front of that door on a Tuesday night in late October and pressed his palm flat against the wood and let his awareness drop down through the floor like a fishing line. Stone. Old stone. Roots of the castle. And below that, magic, dense and bright, the specific brightness of an object rather than a place, something small and enormously powerful, like a star compressed to the size of an apple. And guarding it, he could feel the guard without seeing it, the way you felt a large animal in darkness through vibration and displacement and the particular silence that large things created around themselves, something warm-blooded. Multiple warm-blooded somethings, one of which was large enough to make the floor faintly vibrate when it breathed. "You're back again." He didn't react to the voice, because he'd heard the footsteps coming, because he always heard the footsteps coming. He turned around and looked at Hermione, who was carrying a candle and her notes on Hogwarts, a history with all the guilt and determination of someone who has told themselves they're going to bed and then absolutely not gone to bed. "I couldn't sleep," she said, which was partially true. "What have you found?" He told her. All of it, the layers of warding, the shape of the thing below, the guard he could sense. She listened with her chin down and her eyes up, the way she listened when she was processing at full speed, and when he finished she flipped to a page in her notes and showed it to him. "There was an announcement in the Daily Prophet," she said. "August. Before term. Gringotts break-in, vault number 713. Nothing was taken because whatever had been stored there had already been moved." She tapped the page. The vault was emptied the same day Professor Quirrell came back from a year abroad. His trip to Albania. Which nobody seems to have thought was interesting timing. Harry looked at her. She looked back at him steadily. "You connected those two things weeks ago," he said. "The day after the feast," she confirmed. "I wasn't sure I wasn't sure how seriously you were taking it. Some people hear something doesn't feel right and mean nothing by it. I never mean nothing by it. I know that now." She closed the notebook. Something was moved from Gringotts to Hogwarts. Voldemort, or what's left of him, is connected to Quirrell somehow. The timing, the Albanian trip, the nervous tick that isn't nervous, the turban, Harry said. She frowned. "What about it?" "He never takes it off. In class, at meals, anywhere." He paused. "It smells wrong." Hermione stared at him. "You can smell that something's wrong with his turban?" "I can smell that there's something beneath it that doesn't match. Like," he considered, "like when something's been killed recently and you can't see it but the air knows." He registered her expression. "I have unusual sensory capabilities. My upbringing was unconventional." She digested this with admirable speed. "Quirrell has something under his turban that smells like death," she summarized. "Like a presence that should be dead." "Right." She was already writing. "Which means Voldemort isn't just connected to Quirrell. He's on Quirrell. Which means whatever's under this floor is something Voldemort wants specifically enough to ride a human being across Europe for." "And Dumbledore knows it's here," Harry said. "Obviously. The wards are too sophisticated for anyone below a very high skill level. He put it here, or approved it." "Which means," she stopped. "He's using it as bait," Harry finished. The candle flame between them was very steady, the way candle flames got when the air in a corridor was completely still. They both looked at the door at the end of the third-floor corridor. "The question," Harry said, "is whether we let the trap run. And if the trap catches the wrong thing?" He didn't answer immediately. Because that was the right question, the one that required thought rather than instinct, the kind of question Artemis had trained him to sit with rather than rush. Some hunts are not yours to complete. But this one had his name on it, had had his name on it since before he could walk, and the compass needle pull in his chest that she told him about was very clear, very specific, very much pointing down through the floor toward the thing that smelled like concentrated magic and compressed starlight. "We watch," he said finally. "We learn what we need to learn. And when the time is right," he looked at the door one more time and then turned away, back toward the staircase and the parts of the castle that were warm and lit. "We don't let someone else finish this hunt." Hermione walked beside him, scribbling a note to herself by candlelight, and said, without looking up, "You know, most first-years are worried about getting homework done on time. Are you?" She considered this. "Not particularly." "No," he agreed. "I didn't think so." October moved through November in the way of Scottish autumn, grey giving way to colder grey, the Quidditch pitch rhymed with frost at mornings, the lake going dark and mirror still. Harry flew, not on a Quidditch team, not yet, though he suspected McGonagall was considering him, based on the way she'd watched him in the air during their flying lesson with the focused expression of someone running calculations, but alone sometimes, early morning, when the grounds were quiet. He was up there one Saturday when he came in to land and found Professor McGonagall waiting for him at the edge of the pitch with her arms folded and an expression like impending weather. "Mr. Potter," she said. "I'd like you to try out for the Gryffindor Quidditch team." "I'm in first year," he said. "First years don't make the team." "That is the general rule," she agreed, in a tone that made clear she was aware of the rule and had decided to override it. "There are exceptions for exceptional circumstances. Seeker. Wood has been watching you fly from the stands this past fortnight." He was somewhat emphatic in his recommendation. Harry thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. He'd watched the Quidditch team practice from the stands himself, watched Oliver Wood, the captain, who was organized and passionate and technically sound, watched the flow of 7 players on 7 broomsticks and found the geometry of it interesting, the way any moving system with clear objectives was interesting. "All right," he said. McGonagall looked faintly like she'd braced for more resistance and was recalibrating. "You'll need a broom." "The school brooms are not adequate," Harry agreed. "I'll see to it." He owed for his Nimbus 2000 himself, addressed to James Potter's Gringotts account, and had it in 2 days. McGonagall watched him take his first lap on it during practice and said nothing, which from McGonagall was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Quidditch practice had the pleasant side effect of putting him regularly near Oliver Wood, who in addition to being a fine Quidditch strategist was extremely well informed about the social ecosystem of the school in ways that practical intelligence gathering required. Harry listened to Wood talk about Slytherin's team, about the interhouse dynamics, about the teachers and their relationships, and filed all of it away with the same patient efficiency he applied to everything. The first match was Gryffindor versus Slytherin, scheduled for November. Harry spent the 2 weeks before it studying the Slytherin Seeker, a boy named Terence Higgs, 3rd year, technically competent but with a consistent preference for the right side of the pitch that meant he read the snitch's pattern and then positioned rather than tracked. Harry noted this and moved on. The match itself was cold and wet and the crowd was loud enough to feel like a physical thing. Harry flew high and let himself go still in the air the way Artemis had taught him to go still in the forest, not passive, not vacant, but present, everything turned outward, the tracking part of his mind running on quiet power while he waited. He spotted the snitch 12 minutes in, a flash of gold near the opposite goal posts, and went for it in a long, shallow dive that cut the angle before Higgs registered what was happening. He came up with it in his right hand, arm extended, so that the crowd had a clear view of his closed fist before he even slowed down. He landed on the pitch to approximately half the crowd losing their minds. Hermione met him at the edge of the pitch with an expression of restrained satisfaction. You spotted it at least 40 seconds before he did, she said. 30, he said. I was waiting for the angle. She processed this. You deliberately waited for a better angle rather than just catching it immediately. There's no point in catching the snitch if your chasers are down by 60 at the moment you do it. I was watching the score. He glanced at her. We were up 80 at the time. The angle didn't cost anything. She stared at him for a moment with the specific expression she got when he did something that prompted a recategorization. You're not playing Quidditch, she said slowly. You're running a tactical operation that happens to take place on broomsticks. Is there a difference? She opened her mouth, closed it, and then started writing something down. The troll showed up on Halloween, which Harry suspected was not a coincidence in any year but felt particularly pointed in this one. He was in the Great Hall for the feast when Quirrell burst in with entirely too much theatrical energy for a genuine emergency and pointed toward the dungeons and fainted, which told Harry two things: 1, that something was happening, and 2, that Quirrell had arranged it. You didn't faint after delivering a warning unless fainting was useful to you. The hall erupted. Prefects moved. Dumbledore's voice rose over the crowd with the particular authority of a man accustomed to being heard in chaos, directing students back to their dormitories. Harry was already on his feet and moving against the current, because Hermione was not in the Great Hall and had not been in the Great Hall all evening, and the reason for that, he'd been distantly aware of it since the afternoon, a small thing not yet addressed, was that she'd been upset over something involving Parvati and Lavender and Ron's loud opinion about her at breakfast. And she'd taken herself to the girls' bathroom on the second floor to be upset privately. The second floor was not the dungeons. But the troll would be directed, if Quirrell had anything to do with it. He hit the second floor at a run and turned toward the bathroom and heard it before he saw it, the particular resonance of something very large moving in an enclosed stone space, the low grinding noise of a being that had no concept of its own mass-displacing architecture. The door to the girls' bathroom was hanging off its top hinge. He went through the opening without slowing down. The troll was 12 feet of gray-green skin and blank, piggy eyes and a club the size of a fallen tree, and it filled the bathroom with the smell of something that had been living in a cave for a very long time. Hermione was backed into the far corner, behind a sink that the troll had already reduced to rubble, and her face was, not a face he wanted to see on someone he decided was worth knowing. White, terrified, hands pressed flat against the wall. But her eyes were calculating. Even now, cornered, she was calculating. The troll hadn't noticed Harry yet. He was behind it, in the doorway, and he took exactly 1 second to assess, height, reach, the position of the club, the angle of the arms, the slow intelligence of the eyes, and then he picked up a piece of broken pipe from the floor and threw it at the far wall. The troll turned. Trolls had good sound tracking and bad vision, which Artemis had mentioned once in the context of creatures that were dangerous rather than genuinely threatening to something that knew how to use terrain. Harry moved left, fast and low, while the troll was still turning. He came up from below its line of sight, the eyes were set for detecting things at chest height, not floor height, another anatomical habit of the large, and got one hand on the club as it swung and used the momentum, adding rather than resisting, redirecting it so the club struck the wall instead of Hermione, and the impact knocked the troll off balance. Then he was on its back. Not sensibly, perhaps, not the way a trained fighter was supposed to engage a 12-foot mountain troll, but sensibly was not always the right frame, and right now the right frame was keep it looking the wrong direction while his wand came out. Hermione, he said, almost conversationally, holding on to the troll's neck as it tried to dislodge him, what's the best incapacitating spell for something this size? She stared at him for a fraction of a second. Then her wand was in her hand. Impedimenta. The impediment jinx hit the troll in the knees and dropped it like felled timber. The floor cracked. Harry dropped clear, landed on his feet, and immediately moved between the troll and Hermione as it thrashed. Stupefy, he said clearly, pointing his wand, and a burst of silver-edged red light hit it between the eyes. The troll went still. Breathing. Just unconscious. Harry lowered his wand and turned around. Hermione was looking at him. She was shaking slightly, the adrenaline working through her, but her eyes were steady and the calculation was still running in them. You jumped on a troll's back, she said. It worked. That's not, she stopped. Yes. It did. She looked at the troll, then at him, then at the silver-edged light still fading from the troll's face. Your stupefy is silver. My magic is silver. I know. Is that something to do with who your mother is? He looked at her. He'd said very little about his mother, not because it was a secret but because it wasn't something that translated easily into casual conversation. But Hermione was not casual conversation. She was someone who had just been cornered by a mountain troll and was asking a precise question about magical theory inside the same minute. Yes, he said. Artemis, she said, and it wasn't a question. The shock must have shown on his face, because she looked briefly pleased in the way she looked when research paid off. I've been reading about divine mortal bloodlines, she said. There are 2 documented cases in wizarding history, both ancient, where the offspring of an Olympian deity and a magical human produced a witch or wizard with silver magical discharge and enhanced sensory capability and partial immunity to death magic. She paused. I thought about you. Harry was quiet for a moment. Outside, they could hear footsteps, teachers, coming. How long have you known? He asked. 3 weeks after the feast, she said. The silver light when you practice. The way you smell things before they happen. The fact that you don't flinch. She tilted her head slightly. Normal people flinch. My mother would find that last one insufficient as data. Your mother, Hermione said, sounds extraordinary. She is, he said simply. The door opened. McGonagall arrived first, wand drawn, followed by Snape and then Quirrell, who took in the unconscious troll and Harry and Hermione standing in the center of the destruction and managed an expression of convincing surprise that Harry noted and catalogued. McGonagall stared. Snape's eyes moved to Harry's wand and then to the silver-tinted light still fading from the stone around the troll's head, and something in his expression shifted, sharpened, into something that wasn't quite suspicion and wasn't quite recognition. Harry met Snape's eyes for a moment. The man held it longer than most people did. Then he looked away. McGonagall collected herself. Would you two care to explain? Hermione was in the bathroom, Harry said. I came to get her before it reached this corridor. We engaged it when it came through the door. He looked at Hermione. Hermione incapacitated it. I finished the stun. Hermione caught on instantly. We weren't sure the impediment Jinx would hold for long enough, she said, completely level. McGonagall looked between them. Behind her, Quirrell was watching Harry with eyes that were no longer performing nervousness but something else, something flat and cold and assessing. Harry looked back at him with the particular quality of attention that he reserved for things he was hunting. Quirrell looked away first. Later, walking back to the tower, Hermione said quietly, You covered for me. You were there, Harry said. You helped. You jumped on the troll. I cast one spell while shaking hard enough that I'm amazed it went where I aimed. It went exactly where you aimed, he said. You hit the knees. The joints. That was either excellent control or excellent targeting, and I don't think you were shaking as badly as you thought. She was quiet for a moment. The corridor was empty and the castle was slowly returning to its nighttime settlings around them, the portraits pretending they hadn't been watching, the staircase shifting back into a configuration that suggested it wanted to seem helpful. Harry, she said, and he noticed she'd started using his name more easily than she had at first, the early formality worn away. When Quirrell was looking at you, I know. He's afraid of you specifically. He knows what I am, Harry said. Or close enough. He paused. Voldemort knows. He's been on Quirrell long enough to have access to whatever Quirrell knows about me, and Voldemort is, he stopped, choosing the word carefully. Perceptive. When something is different, he recognizes it. And something being afraid of you doesn't worry you? He thought about it. The dark worries a person who has never lived in it, he said. I was raised in a forest. Dark is just dark. He glanced at her. What worries me is what someone does with their fear. Fear makes people reckless. She absorbed this. So we watch quarrel. We watch quarrel. They reached the portrait of the fat lady, who looked disapproving of their lateness and somewhat excited about the reason for it, and Hermione gave the password, Caput Draconis, and they climbed through. The common room was chaotic. The news of the troll had moved through the castle at the speed of gossip, which was faster than owl post, and every Gryffindor who wasn't in bed was in the common room asking questions. Ron saw them come in and scrambled across the room. Where were you? Are you all right? What happened? Is it true the troll is? We're fine, Hermione said. I was in the bathroom on the second floor. Harry came to get me. Ron looked at Harry with an expression that moved quickly through several stages, relief, and then the beginning of the particular reassessment that happened when you watched someone do something that expanded your picture of them. So you just went looking for her? With the troll loose? She's in our year, Harry said simply. She's mine to look after. Ron processed this. Mine, like, she's your, he means the way a hunter has a pack, Hermione said, with the confidence of someone explaining a concept they'd already worked out, and she wasn't entirely wrong, and Ron looked slightly baffled but nodded as though that made a kind of sense. Harry sat in an armchair by the fire and let the noise of the common room wash over him, and watched the flames and thought about Quirrell's flat cold eyes and the thing beneath the floor, patient and bright, waiting for someone to want it badly enough. He thought about what Artemis had told him, in the forest, about feeling a hunt in your chest like a compass needle. The needle was pointing down. Soon, he thought. But not yet. Across the room, Fred and George Weasley were reenacting what they claimed was the troll fight with increasingly embellished detail and sound effects. Hermione had settled at the table near the window with a book and her notes, quill moving, already processing the evening into something she could use. Neville was asleep in an armchair. Ron was explaining the situation to Dean and Seamus with the particular excitement of someone who has been peripherally involved in something dramatic. The fire cracked and the moonlight fell through the tower window at a familiar angle, and Harry looked at it for a moment, the silver of it, the particular silver that had nothing to do with the castle's enchanted candles and everything to do with something much older. He felt her, briefly, the way you feel the warmth of a fire after you've moved away from it, the residual. Watching. Knowing. He looked back at the fire and let himself settle. Outside, somewhere beyond the grounds and the lake and the tree line of the forbidden forest, a white deer moved through dark undergrowth, and the moonlight followed it the way moonlight sometimes followed things, as though it was paying attention. Chapter 3, Silver and Stone. December arrived like a held breath finally released, cold cracking down from the north, the castle windows frosting at the edges, the lake going iron-gray under skies that couldn't decide between snow and the threat of snow. The corridors smelled of pine resin from the 12 Christmas trees Dumbledore had apparently decided the Great Hall required, and the general atmosphere of Hogwarts shifted into something more relaxed, more festive, more human. Harry found it interesting. He'd never had Christmas, not the wizarding version, not the Muggle one, not any version that involved decorated trees and excessive food and the particular social ritual of giving people objects. The forest had seasons, had winter, had its own ceremonies of cold and darkness and return, but none of them involved tinsel. He was sitting in the library on the second Saturday of December, working through a Latin translation that Flitwick had assigned and finding it slightly amusing because his Latin was better than Flitwick's, when Ron dropped into the chair across from him with the energy of someone who'd been building up to a question for a while. "You're not going home for Christmas," Ron said. "No. Neither am I." "Well, I mean, I could, but Fred and George are staying and Percy's staying and Mum's got enough chaos at the Burrow with," he waved a hand. "Hermione's going home." Harry had known that. Hermione had mentioned it with a mix of excitement, her parents, whom she clearly adored, and guilt, which was Hermione's response to any break in her study schedule. She'd left him a list of research threads she expected him to continue in her absence, annotated with source recommendations, which he'd accepted without comment because it was genuinely useful. "She left you a reading list, didn't she?" Ron said. "Yes. She left me one too. Mine has footnotes." Ron picked up one of Harry's reference books, looked at the cover, put it down. "The thing under the third floor. Have you figured out what it is yet?" Harry looked up. Ron had good ears and better instincts than he sometimes let on, and he'd been quietly tracking the conversation Harry and Hermione had been having in pieces over the past 2 months, not intruding, just absorbing, in the patient way of someone who was used to being one of many and had learned to gather information by waiting rather than asking. "Philosopher's Stone," Harry said, because Ron already knew enough that partial information was more dangerous than complete information. "Nicholas Flamel made it. Turns base metal to gold, produces the elixir of life." Ron stared at him. "The elixir of, so Flamel is still alive?" "He's 665. He and his wife have been using it for centuries. And that's what's under that's what you know who wants." Ron had been working on saying the name since Halloween. He hadn't quite gotten there yet, but he was closer than most adults Harry had met. "And Dumbledore put it here on purpose?" "The stone was at Gringotts. Someone tried to break into the vault, the same day it was moved. Dumbledore moved it here and set up the gauntlet of protections underneath as a trap." Harry closed his Latin text. "The problem is that Voldemort knows it's a trap and doesn't care, because getting the stone is worth the cost of the trap to him. So what do we do?" Harry appreciated that, the "we" offered without ceremony, without requiring any particular acknowledgement. Ron had been doing it since November, quietly folding himself into the orbit of whatever this was. He was brave in the uncomplicated way of someone who'd grown up with a family that loved him and simply hadn't had cause to learn that bravery required special preparation. It was a different kind of courage than what Artemis had built in Harry, but it was real. "We wait," Harry said. "And we learn the protections so that if the timing goes wrong, we know what we're walking into." Ron nodded, like this was a perfectly reasonable thing for 3 first years to be planning. "Right," he said. "Want to play chess while we think about it?" Harry had never played chess. Ron explained it with the enthusiasm of someone sharing a religion, and they played for 3 hours, and Ron won all 6 games, and Harry paid careful attention to how he did it. Christmas at Hogwarts was quiet in the way of things from which most of the inhabitants have temporarily departed. The castle felt larger, less populated, the echoes carrying further in emptied corridors. A handful of students remained, Harry and Ron, a few Hufflepuffs, some Ravenclaws with apparently nowhere more compelling to be. On Christmas morning Harry woke to a small pile at the foot of his bed. He sat up and looked at it with the mild surprise of someone who genuinely hadn't expected anything. Ron was already tearing into a package from home with the focus of someone who knew exactly what was in it, a lumpy maroon jumper, which he put on with the resigned expression of someone who had expected a lumpy maroon jumper. "From his mother," Ron said. She'd sent Harry one too, green, which was either a coincidence or not, with Harry embroidered on the front in gold stitching, and it was warm in the specific way of something made with genuine attention. He wore it. It was, objectively, extremely comfortable. The other gifts were smaller, a card from Hermione containing a precise summary of what he was meant to have read over the holiday and a photograph of her parents' Christmas tree that she'd tucked in with the card as an afterthought, with a small note on the back saying home looks different after Hogwarts. From Hagrid, a tin of rock cakes that were, as advertised, essentially rocks. And something else, wrapped in plain brown paper with no note, no tag, nothing to identify the sender. He opened it and a cloak pooled into his hands, not fabric, exactly, not any material he recognized from either world. It moved like water, like silver light given texture, and when he held it up the air on the other side showed through it, his own hands vanished where the material covered them. He knew what it was from the reading. Invisibility cloaks were rare and this one was something rarer, the quality of it was in a different category than the standard magical cloak, the way a master-forged blade was in a different category than a serviceable knife. He could feel the enchantment in it the way he could feel magic in old stones, deep and settled. He turned it over in his hands and thought about who had sent it. One candidate. One person who had been looking for Harry Potter for 10 years, who had finally found him, who would now be considering what kind of relationship to build and what kind of tools to provide. Interesting choice, he thought, not without appreciation. Dumbledore was establishing something, a channel of communication that bypassed the formal, that said I trust you with something valuable and I expect you to use it wisely simultaneously. An invitation and a test. He folded it carefully and set it aside. Ron looked up from his Chudley Cannons poster. What was that? Invisibility cloak. Ron dropped the poster. You're joking. No note. Anonymous gift. Ron stared at the cloak with the expression of someone trying to decide if they've wandered into a story. Those are incredibly rare, Harry, who would just, someone making a point, Harry said, and Ron, reading his expression, nodded slowly and went back to his poster. That night, Harry wore it. Not because he needed it, he'd been moving through the castle at night perfectly well for months without it, and invisibility was only as useful as the quality of the person beneath it, but because Dumbledore had sent it, and if Dumbledore had sent it with a purpose, the purpose was presumably to be used, and the shape of what Dumbledore wanted him to find was worth understanding. He went to the 6th floor, where the cloak would be unnecessary, and then to the 5th, and worked his way down in a pattern he'd been developing over weeks, cross-referencing what he could feel with what he knew of the architecture. He passed the 3rd floor corridor without stopping, that he already knew. He was looking for something different. Something less obvious. He found it on the 4th floor, down a corridor he'd noted but not yet fully explored, behind an unremarkable tapestry, a room that shouldn't have had a door but did, and behind the door, something that hummed with a magic unlike anything else in the castle. The Mirror of Eriste. He knew it from his reading. Hermione had mentioned it in passing, one of the items she'd catalogued in Hogwarts, a history's appendix, noted as having been in storage for decades. Someone had moved it recently. Someone had placed it in this out-of-the-way room. Dumbledore, constructing his trap with great care. The mirror was enormous, tall enough to show a full-standing person, framed in ornate gold with the inscription running around the top. Eriste stra eru oit ube kafru oit unwosi. He worked the reversal automatically, the backward lettering resolving in a moment. I show not your face but your heart's desire. He stood in front of it. He'd expected something. Power, maybe, or clarity, or the vision of Voldemort destroyed. Some image of the hunt completed. Something that made sense in the context of what he was. What he saw stopped him cold. Not a battlefield. Not a completed hunt. Not the pale body of a dark lord, not the silver landscape of a goddess's domain, not even himself older and capable, which would at least have made a certain kind of sense. A kitchen table. Ordinary wood, lit by afternoon light coming through an ordinary window. A man with dark hair and laughing green eyes, not Harry's green, a warmer green, James Potter's green, in the face of a man who was clearly James Potter slightly older than he'd ever managed to get, sitting sideways in a chair the way people sat when they were comfortable and not trying to look dignified. Across from him, a woman. Not Artemis, not silver eyes and divine stillness, but a real woman, present and warm and laughing at something the man was saying, brown hair catching the light, and across from her, 2 children, arguing happily about something, and a smaller child between them who was clearly doing something ridiculous with a piece of bread. A family. A complete, ordinary, entirely imaginary family. His father's face and beside it people he'd never met and around them the shape of a life that had simply never existed. Harry looked at it for a long time. He was not, as it happened, a person who cried easily. Artemis had not raised him toward easy sentiment, and the grief of his particular origin story was not something he'd been allowed to marinate in. But something moved in his chest looking at that kitchen table, something that wasn't grief exactly and wasn't longing exactly but was something in between them, something that had apparently been quietly waiting in a corner of him for 11 years to have a name. He reached out and pressed one hand flat against the mirror's glass. It was cool and solid and the image didn't waver. Do you know what it shows you? He didn't turn around immediately. Not because the voice startled him, he'd heard the footstep on the stone 2 seconds ago, unhurried, deliberate, the step of someone who wanted to be heard coming, but because he needed the 2 seconds to put whatever was on his face somewhere it wouldn't show. He turned. Dumbledore stood in the doorway with his hands folded and his half-moon glasses catching what little light the room offered, and his expression was, not what Harry had expected. Not triumphant, not the calculating look of a man whose trap had worked. Careful. Almost gentle. Yes, Harry said. I've been thinking, Dumbledore said, stepping into the room with the unhurried ease of someone who is not in a hurry and wants you to know it, that I owe you a direct conversation. Long overdue, I suspect. Probably. Harry moved slightly away from the mirror, not retreating, just repositioning, force of habit, maintaining angles. You sent the cloak. It was your father's, Dumbledore said. It seemed right that you should have it. He looked at the mirror. Most people, when they first see it, cannot look away. They come back night after night. It is not a safe mirror. I noticed that, Harry said. I'm not planning to come back. Dumbledore looked at him then with the full weight of his attention, and it was considerable, the attention of a man who had been reading people for a very long time. No, he said thoughtfully. I don't imagine you would. He was quiet for a moment. I spent 10 years wondering where you were, Harry. I know. I expected, well. I had a plan. A specific plan for a specific young man in a specific set of circumstances, and you are, he paused. You are not that young man. No, Harry agreed. I'm not. Your mother. He said it simply, without preamble, and watched Harry's face. I held a feather the night I arrived at Godric's Hollow. I've been wondering for 10 years whether to be relieved or terrified by what that feather implied. Both seem reasonable, Harry said. The corner of Dumbledore's mouth moved. Indeed. He looked at the mirror again, his own reflection somewhere in it, the old blue eyes unreadable. There is a war coming. Not now, what is here now is a symptom, a recurrence, but properly, eventually. And you are central to it in ways that I must, in honesty, tell you that I don't entirely understand. What I understood, and planned for, was a boy who needed guidance and protection and preparation. He glanced at Harry. What I find instead is someone who has already been prepared. Not for everything, Harry said honestly. I know what I'm hunting. I don't yet know the whole shape of it. Then perhaps, Dumbledore said, we can be useful to each other. Not, I want to be clear, not in the way I originally intended, which I will admit involved a degree of management that I suspect you would find both obvious and counterproductive. A beat. You would, wouldn't you? Yes, Harry said. But I appreciate that you said it. Dumbledore studied him for a long moment. Whatever he'd expected when the boy who'd been missing for 10 years finally walked into his school, whatever shape that expectation had taken, it clearly hadn't been this. Harry could see him recalibrating, rebuilding, the extraordinary intelligence behind those half-moon glasses working at speed. The stone, Harry said. He'll come for it before the end of the year. Yes. Your protections are good. But he'll get through them. That is, also anticipated. Then the last protection is something he can't use. Something that relies on not wanting the stone for personal gain. Harry considered. The mirror. Dumbledore looked at him with an expression that was equal parts impressed and something he couldn't quite categorize. I put it here 4 days ago, he said. I know. I've been tracking the castle's magical geography since September. A longer silence than the others. Harry, Dumbledore said, and his voice had shifted into something more careful. What are you planning to do when he comes? Harry met the old blue eyes steadily. I'm going to end it. He cannot be killed by conventional means. Not in his current state, a spirit, a parasite, without body I know that. I'm not planning to kill him. Not yet. He paused. Not this version. This is, he thought about what Artemis had told him at the fire. Some hunts are not yours to complete. But some are. This is the beginning of the hunt. Not the end. When he comes for the stone, I'm going to strip him of the host and drive him back, and I'm going to make sure he knows what he ran from. Dumbledore was very still. Because right now, Harry said, Voldemort thinks I'm the boy who lived by accident. He thinks I'm a symbol, a lucky survivor, a name on a prophecy. When he comes through that corridor, I want him to understand what is actually hunting him. His voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen. It was very, very calm. That changes how he moves for the rest of this war. And how he moves changes how I hunt him. The mirror reflected them both in the firelight, the old man with stars on his robes and the boy with silver-edged magic and a lightning bolt scar that glowed faintly in the dark. I see, Dumbledore said softly. You should also know, Harry said, that Quirrell has Voldemort on the back of his head. Under the turban. Another silence. I've suspected, Dumbledore said carefully. You've known, Harry said, not unkindly. Since the break-in attempt at Gringotts, you've known that whatever possessed Quirrell was powerful enough and connected enough to attempt a Gringotts vault. Voldemort in Albania, Quirrell visiting Albania, it wasn't difficult. He tilted his head. You let him teach here all year. I wanted him close, Dumbledore said. So did I, Harry said, and his tone made absolutely clear he'd been 3 steps ahead of the containment strategy and had simply been parallel to it rather than caught in it. Dumbledore breathed out slowly. Your mother, he said again, and this time there was something almost like wonder in it, raised a remarkable young man. She raised a hunter, Harry said. They're the same thing, in the end. He folded the invisibility cloak over his arm and walked toward the door. He paused in the doorway, the same doorway Dumbledore had used, the same threshold, and turned back. One more thing, he said. The prophecy. I know it exists. I haven't read it, the Department of Mysteries has the original, but I know the shape of it. Neither can live while the other survives. He met the old blue eyes. I'm not afraid of it. And I'm not going to let it make decisions for me. He left Dumbledore standing alone in the room with the mirror, and the mirror showed the old man whatever it showed him, and Harry walked back through the dark castle under the cloak of his father's gift, and the moonlight through the corridor windows was silver and steady. Hermione came back from Christmas break on January 2nd with the expression of someone who has successfully completed a recovery mission and brought back significant intelligence, which in her case meant 5 additional books, cross-referenced notes on Nicholas Flamel drawn from 3 separate sources including one she'd found at her local library under alchemy and its discontents, a history, and a new quill that wrote approximately 20% faster than her old one. Harry met her in the entrance hall and she took one look at his face and said, "What happened?" He told her, in the library, the whole of it, the mirror, Dumbledore, the conversation. She listened without interrupting, which was something she'd been practicing and was getting good at. When he finished she sat back in her chair and tapped her quill against her notebook with the rhythm of deep thought. The mirror shows you a family, she said. The mirror shows me what I want most, Harry said. That's all it means. It means you're human, she said, very directly, in the tone she used when she was going to say something true and wasn't going to apologize for it. Which you sometimes seem to forget. He looked at her. You're half divine, she said. You've been raised in conditions that most people would describe as extreme. You track things by smell, you can feel magic through stone floors, your stunner is silver, and you've apparently been having tactical conversations with Dumbledore about Voldemort like you're equal parties in a war council. She held his gaze. And the mirror shows you a kitchen table with your dad's face at it. That's not weakness, Harry. She paused, choosing the word. That's the most important information about you that I've found yet. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the library windows the grounds were white with the first proper snow of winter and the Quidditch pitch was invisible under it and the forest was dark and familiar on the far edge of everything. My mother, he said slowly, would say I'm letting the quarry see more than I should. Your mother sounds like she loves you in a way that doesn't always remember you're also a person, Hermione said, with the calm certainty of someone who has thought about this carefully and is prepared to stand by it. The silence stretched. Then Harry said, almost without planning to, she does remember. She loves fiercely. It doesn't always feel gentle. That makes sense, Hermione said, and went back to her notes, which somehow made it easier rather than harder, and Harry found himself thinking that this was perhaps what Artemis couldn't teach him, the specific skill of being known by someone without flinching from it. January into February into March unfolded with the particular compressed intensity of a year that was building toward something. Harry played Quidditch with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided to win every match and treated the intervals between matches as time better spent on the thing beneath the school. Hermione organized her research into the stone's protections with the same systematic rigor she brought to everything, cross-referencing what she knew about each professor's specialty with what she could infer about their contribution to the gauntlet. Ron played chess against Harry every evening and won less and less frequently and had the grace to look more impressed than smug about it. Professor Snape watched Harry in potions with the specific attention of a man who was trying to fit a phenomenon into a category and kept finding the edges wrong. Harry performed adequately in class, not brilliantly, not in a way that demanded attention, not because he was hiding anything but because potions as taught to first years was the equivalent of showing someone who could navigate by stars how to read a compass. He got everything right, quickly, and Snape had apparently decided that the competence was more interesting than the modesty. After class one afternoon in February, Snape kept him back. The dungeon emptied. Snape stood at his desk with a vial in his hand and looked at Harry with those dark eyes that were very difficult to read, not because they were empty but because they were extremely full of something tightly controlled. Your mother, Snape said. No qualifier, no direction. Harry looked at him steadily. Yes. Lily Potter, Snape said, and something moved in his face, barely, quickly, the surface of something very deep going faintly turbulent. I knew her. Before she died. He stopped. Your eyes. My eyes are my father's, Harry said quietly. I look like James Potter. Yes. Snape set the vial down. You have none of her in your face. I have a different mother, Harry said, and watched Snape absorb it, not the usual way people absorbed it, with confusion or disbelief or the scramble for context, but with the slow comprehension of a man who had been a spy and therefore had very good pattern recognition. Snape looked at him. Looked at the silver trace around his wand hand. Looked at his eyes. The night at Godric's Hollow, Snape said slowly. The rebounded curse. The reason it rebounded, it wasn't simply Lily's sacrifice. His voice had taken on the quality of someone talking through a calculation in real time. There was something already in the child. A divine protection. Native. Inherent. The curse hit something it couldn't process, Harry said. Yes. Snape was quiet for a very long moment. I have been watching you since September, he said, and I have not been able to decide whether you are the most dangerous student ever to sit in this classroom or whether I simply have insufficient category for you. Both, probably, Harry said. Probably, Snape agreed, and it came out almost dry, almost something adjacent to humor, and he picked up the vial again and turned away. Your potion from today had the correct base, but the timing on the Lacewing edition was 2 seconds early. The difference is negligible in the short term. Fix it. Yes, sir, Harry said, and left, and in the corridor he thought about Snape's face when he'd said Lily Potter, the specific quality of that tightly controlled something, and filed it under things to understand better, because understanding was always more useful than not. On the first day of June, the thing beneath the school moved. Harry felt it the way you felt a weather change, not a single signal but an accumulation, the particular quality of pressure that built over hours. He was at dinner when it started, a low persistent pull at the edge of his awareness, and by the time dinner was half over he was tracking it the way he tracked Corey, the compass needle sensation that Artemis had described, pointing not down now but down and urgent. He looked at Hermione across the table. She was already looking at him. "Tonight," she said softly. "Tonight," he confirmed. Ron, on Harry's other side, set down his goblet. "Right," he said simply. They went up to Gryffindor Tower after dinner and Harry paused in the middle of the common room and turned around. Neville was by the fire working on an astronomy chart. The evening was ordinary and warm and full of the end-of-year energy of students beginning to think about going home. "Neville," Harry said. Neville looked up. "If Snape, or anyone, tries to come through that portrait hole tonight, you've never seen us." Harry looked at him steadily. "Can you do that?" Neville sat up slightly. His round face was still, not the nervous stillness of someone trying to be brave but the thoughtful stillness of someone deciding. "Yes," he said. "I can do that." "Good man," Harry said, and meant it. They took the cloak, wands, and the notes Hermione had compiled over 8 months on the protections below. In the corridor outside the portrait hole, Harry stopped and looked at them both, Ron straight-backed and slightly pale and completely resolved, Hermione with her notes folded in her pocket and her wand already in her hand and her jaw set in the way that meant she decided this was right and that was that. "You both know what we're walking into," Harry said. "Fluffy," Ron said, who had learned from his brothers. "Enchanted harp or music, puts it to sleep. Devil's snare," Hermione. "Light and warmth, heat, specifically," Hermione said. "Flying keys, the winged ones, your job, Harry." "Chess, Ron," Harry said. "I know," Ron said, and smiled, quick and sharp. "Troll, Dumbledore's already knocked it out, I imagine. And then Snape's fire riddle." Harry looked at Hermione. "That's yours." "The logic puzzle." "Yes." She patted her pocket. "And then the mirror, and whatever is waiting at the mirror." Harry's wand was in his hand, the silver light of his magic visible in the faintest trace around his fingers. "If it goes badly in there, if something goes wrong, I need you both to run. Not debate, not help me, not, just run." "Right," said Ron. Hermione gave him the look she reserved for instructions she was filing under noted but not necessarily agreed to. "Hermione," he said. "I heard you," she said, which was not the same as a promise and both of them knew it. He didn't push it. He pulled the cloak over all 3 of them, cramped, the cloak built for 1 and currently covering 3 feet visible if anyone looked carefully, and they moved through the silent corridors toward the 3rd floor. The dog was enormous in the way of things that had been specifically bred to exist beyond normal parameters, 3 heads, each one the size of a large shipping crate, and the smell of it was almost solid in the small room. It was asleep, one head pillowed on its own paw, the enchanted harp in the corner playing something that Harry vaguely recognized as a folk melody transposed to a key that vibrated in a frequency that worked on very large canines. Harry moved past it with the specific combination of speed and stillness that was his native mode, quick but without urgency, without the spike of adrenaline that animals could smell. He was at the trapdoor and had it open before the harp had gotten through its 2nd repetition. The fall into Devil's Snare was, objectively, unpleasant. Dark and cold and the tendrils immediately purposeful, and beside him he heard Ron starting to struggle and Hermione already completely still and composed, one hand raised, the whispered incantation carrying down the dark. Fire erupted in a contained column, bright and deliberate, and the snare recoiled from it like something with opinions about heat, and they dropped through onto stone and kept moving. The key room was full of the sound of wings, hundreds of winged keys swooping in patterns that Harry read the way he read anything moving through space. He mounted a broom that was leaning against the wall and went up into the chaos of them with the focused calm of someone who had been catching fast-moving things since childhood, his eyes sorting through the flock, reading not the keys themselves but the slight irregularity in the pattern, the one that was different, the one that had been used before and bore it in its flight path, slightly damaged on the right wing. He had it in 15 seconds. The door opened. The chess room made Ron go very still with the particular stillness of someone who has found their terrain. "Let me," Ron said. Harry looked at the board, enormous, the pieces human-sized and with the patient menace of things that had been waiting for a match to be worth their time. He assessed it quickly. He'd been losing to Ron less and less, but this was Ron's category, genuinely, and he'd learned enough from Artemis about the three knowledges to know which hunts were his and which weren't. "It's yours," Harry said. What happened next was the clearest demonstration Harry had seen of what Ron Weasley was at his best, not the youngest Weasley son, not someone performing competence, but a tactician in absolute clarity, moving pieces with the precision of someone who had been thinking several moves ahead since before the game started. He sacrificed his bishop quickly, efficiently, without hesitation. He sacrificed his own piece, the knight, with a calm that was almost brutal, looking at Harry and Hermione as it happened and saying only, "Go." The knight's horse took the queen. Ron was knocked from the board and he landed hard and he didn't get up and Harry moved, already calculating, already past the grief of it because grief after the fact was a luxury and grief during was a cost you couldn't afford. The next chamber had a troll already knocked unconscious, as he predicted. They went through without stopping. The fire riddle was Hermione at her most complete, 7 bottles, 3 doors, the problem laid out in the logic of someone very clever trying to stump the ambitious and reckless, and Hermione read it twice and solved it in approximately 90 seconds, which Harry suspected was the fastest it had ever been solved. "There's enough for one person to go forward and one person to go back," she said, handing him the small bottle. "You go forward. Hermione, go back and help Ron," she said, handing him the other bottle. "I'll wait here." She met his eyes with complete steadiness. "Harry. It has to be you. We both know that." He took the bottle. He looked at her for one moment, the brown eyes bright and certain, the jaw set, the specific bravery of someone who had decided what mattered and was acting accordingly, and he said, "I'll come back." "I know you will," she said, like it wasn't in question. He walked through the black fire. Quirrell was standing in front of the mirror. The room was lit by torchlight, the mirror at its center, the gold frame catching the flame. Quirrell had his back to Harry when Harry came through, and he turned with the mechanical deliberateness of someone receiving an expected visitor. "I wondered," Quirrell said, "when you'd come." The turban was off. The back of his head was wrong. Something lived there that wasn't Quirrell, pressed against the surface of the man like a mask worn from the inside, and the smell of it hit Harry's senses like a cold wave, ancient, hungry, deeply wrong in the way of something that had cut its own roots and was surviving on other things. "Potter," said the voice from the back of Quirrell's head. It was not Quirrell's voice. It was something refined, something precise, something with its own terrible elegance. Voldemort looked out from a stolen face with red eyes that had no whites. "I expected more time before we arrived here." "So did I," Harry said honestly. "But here we are." Voldemort studied him. The red eyes moved over him with a quality of attention that was different from anyone else Harry had ever been looked at by, not calculating, not assessing, but recognizing. The way one predator recognized another. "I can feel what you are," Voldemort said, with something in his voice that was almost appreciation. "The silver in you. The divine thread. I have read about such things, the old bloodlines, the divine crossing. I had not expected to find one here. In this form." He tilted the head, Quirrell's head, tilted from behind. "You are not afraid." "No. Most things are afraid of me." "I know. I'm not most things." "No," Voldemort said, and there was something in it, not respect, not from him, not for anyone, but something adjacent to it, the intellectual acknowledgement of one exceptional mind to another. "What are you planning to do, child?" "Drive you out," Harry said. "And make sure you know what drove you." The red eyes held on him for a beat. "You believe you can." I know I can. The question is how much of Quirrell I have to damage to do it. Quirrell screamed, the first time Harry had heard Quirrell's own voice, unfiltered, desperate and terrified, the voice of a man who had sold himself and was still paying the price. Kill him. Quirrell screamed. Just kill. The killing curse came from Quirrell's wand. Harry moved, not sideways, not a dodge in the standard sense, but through, angling past the bolt of green with the tight, controlled motion of someone for whom a hair's breadth was a comfortable margin, and he felt the curse go by his ear like wind off a falling tree, close enough to feel it, but nothing that touched him could touch the thing Artemis had built into him. He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and grabbed Quirrell's wand hand. The reaction was immediate and extraordinary. Quirrell's skin where Harry's hand touched it went white, then cracked, then began to burn, because whatever lived in Harry's touch in this moment was divine, and Voldemort was the furthest thing in existence from divine, and the contact between them was like light poured into a vacuum, brutal and instant. Quirrell screamed. Voldemort screamed, different, tighter, the sound of something being forced out of a container it had taken up residence in. Harry held on. He didn't hold on out of cruelty. He could feel Quirrell under his hands, could feel the human part of the man, terrified and damaged and complicit and also undeniably still alive, still there. He held on because this was the moment Artemis had named, the compass needle pointing directly at this specific second, and he did what the 3 knowledges had been built to teach him, he picked the right moment to strike. He let his magic come. It was silver, and it was his, and it was half divine and half the bloodline of a man who had been brave enough to stand in front of a door for his family, and it came from his hands into Quirrell's skin like moonlight through still water, spreading and finding and burning through every tendril and thread and rootless hungry presence that wasn't Quirrell. The room went very bright. Voldemort came out of Quirrell like smoke from a crack in stone, a shape, barely, the suggestion of a face and 2 red eyes and a scream that was less sound than sensation, a thing expressing itself in pure fury and pure terror, and for one moment those red eyes were level with Harry's green ones. I will return, Voldemort said, in the tone of someone making a statement of fact rather than a threat. I know, Harry said. I'll be here. Something moved in the red eyes that was not fear. Voldemort did not feel fear in the conventional sense, Harry understood that much, but was the recognition of a fact about the future that was unwelcome. An equation that had just resolved to a different answer than expected. Then he was gone. Through the wall, through the stone, into the darkness that took him, and the room went cold and still. Quirrell was on the floor. Alive, barely, damaged in ways that were going to take time to understand, but alive. Harry knelt beside him for a moment and checked the breath and pulse with the practical care of someone who knew how to assess injury, and then he stood up and turned around. Dumbledore was in the doorway. The old man looked at Quirrell on the floor, at the mirror behind Harry, at Harry himself, the silver light still fading from his hands, the room still ringing with the aftermath of what had happened. His expression was something Harry hadn't seen on him yet. He's gone, Harry said. Westward. He'll find something else, something with less, he won't try a human host again, I think. Not for a while. He'll need time to regroup. And the stone? Dumbledore said. Harry glanced at the mirror. Safe. He never got it. He paused. I looked at it again, when I came through. The stone is in my pocket. Dumbledore looked at him. The old blue eyes were full of something deep and complex and entirely genuine. The mirror shows you what you desire, Dumbledore said. And what you saw, a family, Harry said simply. It showed me a family. And when I looked a second time, wanting the stone, the mirror gave it to me because I didn't want it for myself. He reached into his pocket and held it out, a small, smooth stone, red as fresh coals, warm in the palm. I don't need it. Neither does Flammel, not anymore, not really, he stopped. That's a conversation for later. Dumbledore took the stone with hands that were not entirely steady. Harry looked at him for a long moment, the most powerful wizard in Britain, old and extraordinary and genuinely good, standing in a torchlit room holding a stone the size of a walnut, recalibrating the shape of everything he'd thought the next decade would look like. "Thank you," Dumbledore said, and meant it, all of it, in every direction. "Don't thank me," Harry said. "Just be honest with me. Going forward. Whatever comes next," he met the blue eyes directly. "I'm not a piece on a board. I'm the one playing." "Yes," Dumbledore said softly. "I see that now." Harry walked past him toward the door, toward Hermione waiting on the other side of the black flame, toward Ron who needed someone to be with him when he woke up, toward the rest of the school year and the summer and whatever came after. Behind him, the mirror of Ariste reflected an empty room. And the torchlight, settling back to ordinary warmth, was the only thing that moved. Chapter 4, The Chamber Speaks. Summer came and went the way summers did when you had been raised in wilderness, not as a break from the real world but as the real world itself, reclaiming its rightful proportion. Harry spent July and August in the forest with Artemis, and it was not a gentle reunion. She had been watching. Of course she had been watching. The night he'd driven Voldemort from Quirrell, she'd found him in the forest 3 days after term ended and looked at him the way she looked at the moon when it was full, with something that was simultaneously assessment and pride, the two so blended in her that he'd stopped trying to separate them years ago. "You held on too long," she said, by way of greeting. They were sitting by the fire, the same fire they'd always sat at, the forest breathing around them in the deep summer dark. The contact with the host. "You could have driven the fragment out in half the time." "I wanted to make sure I got all of it," Harry said. "Every tendril." "You got all of it," she agreed. "And you also nearly lost 2 fingers on your left hand to the backlash." He looked at his left hand. The fingers were fine now, had been fine within a day, the divine blood in him handling physical damage with an efficiency that would have been remarkable in a purely human person. But she was right that for approximately 4 seconds there had been a question. "I'll be faster next time," he said. "Yes," she said. "You will." She was quiet for a moment, the fire between them, the stars overhead. "Dumbledore. We have an understanding." "An understanding." She looked at him sideways, silver eyes catching the flame. "You're being managed." "I'm being given information in exchange for autonomy," Harry said. "That's different from being managed." "He knows the difference too, I made sure of it." She considered this for a long time. Long enough that the fire settled and resettled and an owl drifted through the clearing on its nighttime business and was gone. "The prophecy," she said finally. "Neither can live while the other survives." "Yes. How does that sit with you?" He was honest, because she always knew when he wasn't. "Like a constraint I haven't yet found the edges of," he said. "I'm not going to pretend it's nothing. But I'm not going to let it make decisions for me either." She nodded once, slow, the way she nodded when the answer was sufficient and she was letting the conversation close. Then she got up and handed him a new bow, not an upgrade, precisely, but refined. The limbs worked from something that wasn't any wood he recognized, the string a silver that matched his magic exactly. "For the next phase," she said. He took it, and the weight of it settled into his hands like something that had been waiting to be held. September 1st brought platform 9 3/4 back into his life with all its noise and smoke and the particular chaos of families saying goodbye. He found Hermione at the barrier, her parents were there, a couple with warm eyes who looked at Harry with the careful assessment of people who had heard about him from their daughter and were deciding whether the reality matched the account. It did, apparently, because her mother shook his hand and said, "She talks about you rather a lot," with a smile that was slightly teasing and entirely genuine. "She's the most capable person in our year," Harry said honestly, and her father laughed and her mother looked pleased and Hermione made a face that was trying to be irritated and kept resolving into something else. Ron appeared with his family, the full Weasley complement, which was something to witness, a family so physically present and emotionally loud that they seemed to occupy more space than their numbers strictly accounted for. Harry stood in the middle of it and let it happen around him the way he let weather happen, not uncomfortable but aware of being a different species of person in this particular ecosystem. Mrs. Weasley hugged him. He had not been prepared for that. Not a brief polite contact but a real embrace, warm and firm and completely unself-conscious, because Molly Weasley was the kind of person who, once she had decided you were being looked after you with her whole body. He stood slightly stiff for 1 second and then something in him, the something the mirror had shown, the kitchen table, the afternoon light, relaxed, and he let it happen. On the train, settled into their compartment with Hermione already deep in a book she'd found over the summer and Ron describing the Chudley Cannon's disastrous pre-season in vivid detail, Harry felt the shift of the year beginning and thought about the something that was coming that he didn't yet have the shape of. He'd been feeling it since August. Not the clear compass pull of a hunt in progress but the preliminary sense, the way a skilled tracker knew a large animal had been through an area hours ago, not because they could see it but because the environment remembered it. Something was different this year. Something had moved. When the compartment door slid open and Draco Malfoy looked in, Harry looked back at him with the specific quality of attention you gave something you'd been thinking about. Malfoy was different. Not dramatically, the blonde hair was the same, the grey eyes, the careful presentation of someone who'd been taught that appearance was a statement. But something in his posture had shifted since June. A new kind of tension, something installed over the summer. He was performing Malfoy more consciously than he had been, which meant something had happened that made him feel the performance was more necessary. "Potter," he said. Crabbe and Goyle flanked him in the doorway, decorative. "Malfoy," Harry said. He didn't move, didn't shift in his seat. The economy of a person who has decided that adjusting your posture for someone else's benefit is a gift you should choose to give. "Is there something you need?" Malfoy looked around the compartment. At Hermione, who had lowered her book and was watching him with polite attentiveness. At Ron, who was visibly deciding whether he needed to say something about the Malfoy family's known political positions. Back to Harry. "My father," Malfoy said, and stopped, and started again. "My father says this year will be different. At the school." "Different how?" Harry asked. "The governors have approved new teaching staff." He paused. Lockhart. Harry had heard the name over the summer, a best-selling author, a series of adventure books about his own exploits, a face on posters in Diagon Alley with hair that required some kind of supernatural maintenance. He'd been unimpressed. Defense against the dark arts. Yes. Something moved in Malfoy's face, complicated, a thing he was keeping controlled. "And the other thing, the governors have agreed to revisit the ban on certain items at the school." Harry looked at him steadily. "Which items?" Malfoy met his eyes for a moment, and again there was that flicker, that read and register that was his better instinct running under the performance. "I'll leave that to you to work out," he said, and was gone, Crabbe and Goyle vanishing with him like large, loyal furniture. Hermione turned to Harry immediately. "That was a warning." "Yes," Harry said. "He warned you," she said again, like she wanted to confirm she'd understood correctly. "He gave me information I could use," Harry said. "Whether it was charity or strategy, I don't know yet. But the information is real." He looked at the compartment window, the countryside running past in the late summer green of early September. "Something's been introduced into the school. Something his father had a hand in." "The governors," Ron said, and his voice had a different quality now, the Weasley family in politics quality, the knowledge that came from growing up in a household where the ministry dinner table talk was unavoidable. "Dad said the board has been getting pressure from Malfoy Sr. all summer. He's been leveraging donations against policy decisions. So Lucius Malfoy has placed something in the school," Hermione said slowly. "Or someone," Harry said. Lockhart was exactly what his books had suggested, which was to say he was a performance wearing a man, a very successful performance that had somehow convinced both its audience and itself. He arrived in the great hall for the start-of-term feast in robes of a particular shade of turquoise that suggested enormous confidence in one's own coloring, with teeth that appeared professionally maintained and hair that had not occurred naturally. He also smelled afraid, which was something Harry registered within the first 20 seconds of proximity, the specific chemical signature of anxiety dressed up in a very elaborate costume. In his first defense class, Harry sat near the back and watched Lockhart perform, the vocabulary, the smile, the way he handled questions, which was to redirect them toward himself. He was testing Harry from the first minute, Harry knew, the way everyone who was anxious about him tested him, trying to establish a version of Harry they could manage. "Now, Harry," Lockhart said, in the specific tone of someone trying to establish intimacy by first naming a student, "I expect you've heard of my encounter with the Wagga Wagga werewolf." Laverne de Montmorency identified the Wagga Wagga case as a misdiagnosed lysovirus infection in 1987, Harry said pleasantly. "The creature in your account behaves inconsistently with verified werewolf behavior. The moon phases you describe don't match a standard lunar cycle. So either the werewolf in question had atypical physiology or the account has some creative elements." The silence in the classroom had the specific quality of air before lightning. Lockhart's smile stayed on. Professionals could do that, hold the expression independent of what was happening behind it. "Well, yes, there are always certain simplifications required for a popular audience, of course," Harry said, and went back to his notes, and the class moved on. After class, Hermione said, "You knew that would humiliate him." "I knew it was true," Harry said. "I don't particularly care how it landed." "You could have said it privately." "I could have," he agreed. "But if he's teaching defense against the dark arts and he can't actually do it, the class needs to know that before someone relies on something he teaches." "That's not cruelty, Hermione. That's information management." She thought about it. "I don't entirely disagree," she said, with the care of someone who is choosing honesty over comfort. "I just think there's a version of it that was also a little bit satisfaction." He paused. "Maybe," he admitted, which was rare enough that she looked quietly pleased about it. The whispers started in October. Harry heard the first one on a Thursday evening, walking back from the library with his bag over one shoulder and his mind on the essays Snape had assigned on the properties of boomslang skin, and then he stopped, mid-stride, one foot not yet planted on the stone floor. "Come to me. Let me rip you. Let me kill you." He'd heard voices before, animal voices, the language of the forest, things that spoke in frequencies humans weren't built to receive. He'd heard the language of old magic in stone and water and wood. But this was different. This was a voice in a language he knew the same way he knew Greek, not learned, but inherited, something in his blood that understood it before his mind did. Parseltongue. He dropped his bag, turned on the spot, and went still. His eyes moved along the wall, the floor, the ceiling, tracking the direction of sound the way he tracked sound in the forest, triangulating, placing. The voice was below him and moving away, something long and patient and enormously old moving through passages in the walls that hadn't been used in a very long time. He followed it at speed, down one corridor and up another, past the Transfiguration courtyard and through a passage he'd mapped months ago, until he came to a bathroom on the second floor, this bathroom, the one where the tap had always been broken, and stopped. The snake was gone. The voice was gone. But something remained, a trail, a presence without presence that was the magical equivalent of warm earth where something large had been lying. He stood in the bathroom and looked at the tap and thought about what he knew. A voice only he could hear. Parseltongue. An old passage system in the walls. A school with 60 years of myth attached to a particular phrase, Chamber of Secrets, and a year in which something had been introduced that Lucius Malfoy had a hand in. He was still standing there when Hermione found him, which took approximately 8 minutes because she had apparently tracked him by the dropped bag and the route from the library, which was both impressive and not surprising. "You heard something," she said. "A snake," he said. "Speaking. Through the walls." She looked at the walls, and the tap, and the specific arrangement of this particular bathroom, and something in her expression went from alert to fully lit. "The Chamber of Secrets," she said. "The legend, Salazar Slytherin, the monster, the heir, is real," Harry said. "Or is being made real." He looked at the tap again. Slytherin was a Parselmouth. "The entrance to the chamber would need, Parseltongue," she breathed. "To open. I need to know what's in the chamber first," Harry said. Before we go down. I need to know what kind of predator we're dealing with. There are books, she said immediately. There are always books, he said, which was not a criticism, and they went to find them. What Hermione found in the library, over 3 days of methodical research, was a thread. Basilisk lore crossed with Chamber of Secrets references crossed with a 60-year-old memory that had been quietly buried in the school's own history. Moaning Myrtle, a ghost, a girl, dead in a bathroom for 50 years, who cried instead of answering questions and had, apparently, never been properly interviewed about the night she died. Harry went to talk to Myrtle himself. She was everything the name suggested, hovering over a toilet cistern in a flooded bathroom, translucent with perpetual misery, the specific sadness of someone whose primary identity had been the worst moment of their life for half a century. She looked at Harry when he came in with the expression ghosts used when they were deciding whether to be dramatic at you. If you've come to make fun, I haven't, Harry said. He sat down on the edge of a dry sink, which positioned him roughly at her eye level. I want to know how you died. She blinked. Nobody ever asks that. I'm asking. What came out of her was not the clean narrative of someone who'd had time to organize their memories but the fractured, circling account of someone for whom the memory was still present tense, the crying, the flooding floor, the decision to open her eyes, and then the yellow eyes, and then nothing. Yellow eyes, Harry said. You looked directly at them. Just for a second, and you died, he said carefully. Not from injury. Not from venom. You looked at them and died. She nodded, and the misery in her face shifted slightly towards something that was almost curiosity, the look of someone whose worst experience had just been treated as important information rather than a sad story. Thank you, Myrtle, Harry said, and stood up, and she looked so surprised by the courtesy that she nearly fell off her cistern. He found Hermione in the library with his conclusion already forming. Basilisk, he said, dropping into the chair across from her. She looked up from the bestiary she was reading. I know, she said. I got there this morning. She turned the book around and showed him the page, the serpent illustration, the yellow eyes, the notation about petrification versus death. The king of serpents. A gaze that kills instantly. A voice that paralyzes. Mortal to spiders. Vulnerable at mirrors. Mirrors, Harry said. Reflections only partially transmit the lethal quality of the gaze. Produces petrification rather than death. She paused. That's why there have been no casualties yet. People have been seeing it in water, in reflections, in polished surfaces. They're being lucky without knowing it. The cat, Harry said. Mrs. Norris, petrified, she said. Not dead. The puddle on the floor. And nearly headless Nick, ghosts can't die twice, so petrification produces something more like suspended animation. She set the book down. Harry, a basilisk in the chamber with access to the castle's entire plumbing system, it can move anywhere there are pipes large enough. We need to find the diary, Harry said. She looked at him. The diary? Malfoy introduced something into the school. Something his father had a hand in. He'd been thinking about this, the thread that went from Lucius Malfoy's political maneuvering to the governor's pressure to something placed. A diary. 60 years old. There's a memory in it, a preserved version of a 16-year-old boy who wanted to be found. He paused. Who wanted to be used? Tom Riddle, Hermione said immediately. Because of course she'd found the name, the trophy case in the entrance hall, 50-year-old Special Services to the School Award, T.M. Riddle. You think the diary is controlling someone? Possessing them, gradually, Harry said. Using them to open the chamber, direct the basilisk, recreate whatever it was trying to do 50 years ago when Riddle was in school. He leaned forward. Riddle is Voldemort. An earlier version. A piece of him preserved in paper and ink. The library was very quiet around them, the way libraries got in the late afternoon when most people had gone back to their common rooms. Hermione's quill was still in her hand, not writing, just held. He's 17 in that diary, she said. By 17 he was already Voldemort. He was already halfway there, Harry said. Brilliant, dangerous, obsessed with blood purity and immortality. And whoever has the diary right now is being slowly fed to him. He stood up. We need to find out who has it. They found out 11 days later, and the answer was Ginny Weasley, and she was already in the chamber. Ron had gone grey. Not the performance of fear, the actual thing, the bloodless reality of someone who has received information so bad that the body responds before the mind catches up. He sat in the empty Transfiguration classroom where Harry had found him, and Hermione and the rest of the increasingly impossible situation had arrived at its current state. A note on the wall in Ginny's handwriting, their idiotic defense teacher hexed from behind in the hallway by persons unknown and currently locked in his own office, the school in a state of lockdown, and Harry and Ron the last people to have seen Ginny going somewhere she shouldn't. She's been writing in that diary for months, Ron said. His voice was careful in the way of someone maintaining it by effort. I saw it, but I thought it was just a diary. I didn't think it was. She was going to tell me something in September, she said it was important, and I told her to wait because the Quidditch schedule was posted and he stopped. Ron, Harry said. I should have listened. Yes, Harry said, which was honest and also the only thing to say to a person who needed honesty more than comfort in that specific moment. But that's done. What happens now is what matters. He looked at him steadily. She's alive. Riddle needs her alive. He's been drawing life from her, building himself, but he needs a living person for the possession to complete. We have time. Not much, but some. Ron looked at him with the face of someone deciding whether to believe that because they want to or because it's true. You're sure? The possessive process for a memory fragment requires an active host for completion, Hermione said, from behind her notes. She'd been reading and listening simultaneously, the way she did when the situation required both. Tom Riddle can't fully manifest without her. If she were dead, there would be no ceremony, no completion. She's leverage, not a sacrifice. She's 12, Ron said. I know, Harry said. He stood up. The bathroom. Myrtle's bathroom, the entrance has to be there, where Myrtle died 50 years ago, where Riddle opened it the first time. He looked at Ron. Are you with me? Ron stood up. He was still pale, but the gray was receding, replaced by something harder and redder. She's my sister, he said, and that was all. Lockhart was in the corridor outside Myrtle's bathroom when they arrived, and he was packing, which under other circumstances might have been merely pathetic. He had a bag, and in the bag were the contents of his office, the gilded portraits of himself, the stacks of his own books, the awards, and he was moving with the purposeful efficiency of a man who has calculated the odds and made a decision about which way they fell. Harry looked at him. Where are you going? Well, the situation is clearly, there are matters I need to attend to. There's a 12-year-old girl in the chamber, Harry said. That you're responsible for defense at this school. Lockhart's professional smile made one last doomed attempt and failed completely. What was underneath it was very human and not flattering, a man who was genuinely frightened, who had built a career on borrowing other people's courage and had just hit the point where there was no more to borrow. I'm not actually, he stopped. Started again. The books aren't, entirely, I know, Harry said. I've known since September. He studied him for a moment. You're going to come with us into the chamber. Lockhart stared at him. Because if you leave, Harry said, simply and without anger, everyone in this school will know by morning exactly who you are, and you'll spend the rest of your life explaining yourself. Or, he tilted his head, you can come down here and do one genuine thing, and that's worth considerably more than another book. The silence stretched. What do I have to do? Lockhart said, and his voice was very small. Stand behind us, Harry said, and don't hex anything without being told to. It was not, perhaps, a great rallying speech. But Lockhart followed them into the bathroom. The tap opened under Harry's parseltongue, a phrase that came to him without thought, the same way Greek came or the language of wolves, fluid and immediate, and the tap glowed and the sink swung aside and the darkness opened beneath them. The slide down was long and dark and ended in a tunnel full of bones, animal bones, small ones, the leavings of something large and patient. Lockhart had gone very quiet. Ron had his wand in his hand, the light at its tip steady, and Harry moved ahead with the bow over his shoulder and the silver light of his magic visible at his fingertips, not summoned, just present, the way it always was when things were serious. The tunnel was enormous, built for something enormous, the stone carved and shaped by old magic of a specific, cold variety. Snakeskin shed along the walls, dried and cracked, the scale of it suggesting something the size of a school bus. Harry tracked as he walked, the age of the skin, the passage patterns, the temperature and smell of the air, the specific absence of sound that said the basilisk was elsewhere in its tunnel system, not here. The passage split. Harry stopped, listening. "There's a collapse," Ron said, from the rear. A section of tunnel ceiling had given way, filling the passage with rubble to the roof. Harry looked at it and calculated, passable, but barely, and for one at a time, and with a basilisk loose in the system. "You and Lockhart go back," Harry said. "Harry, get the teachers," Harry said. "Dumbledore. McGonagall. Tell them the entrance, the location, everything Hermione found." He looked at Ron steadily. "I'll have Ginny with me when you come back down." Ron stared at him. He had his sister's potential death and his friend's certain aloneness in front of him, and he was very clearly aware that neither was acceptable and only one was actionable. "Bring her back," Ron said. "Yes," Harry said. He went through the gap alone, and behind him the tunnel went quiet. The chamber was older than the school above it. That was the first thing you understood when you stood inside it, not built as part of the structure but predating it, a space that had been here before Hogwarts was imagined, carved from the living rock by someone with extraordinary power and very specific ideas about their legacy. Stone serpents climbed the columns. Torches lit as Harry stepped inside, responding to Parseltongue, probably, or to his presence specifically, something in his blood that the chamber recognized as kin to what had built it. Ginny was at the far end, on the floor. Still breathing, he could see it from across the chamber, the rise and fall, the specific quality of deep unconsciousness that was different from sleep. Alive. Between him and her, Tom Riddle. Not the ghost of Tom Riddle, not a memory or a shadow. A physical presence, mostly, imperfectly, the solidity of someone in the process of becoming real again, like a developing photograph. He was tall, dark-haired, with a handsome face that wore its handsomeness the way weapons wore their polish, and in his hand was a wand, Ginny's wand, borrowed against her will. He looked at Harry with the red-tinged eyes of someone who had been on the edge of becoming Voldemort for 60 years and had arrived, in this moment, very close. "Harry Potter," Riddle said. "I wondered if you'd come alone." "I generally work alone," Harry said, walking forward with his hands at his sides, the bow still on his shoulder, eyes moving, Ginny, Riddle, the ceiling, the statue at the far end, the darkness at its base. "It's more efficient." "So like him," Riddle said, with a contempt that was almost admiring. "Your father. James Potter." Confident to the point of carelessness. "I'm not careless," Harry said. He kept moving, steady pace, crossing the distance between them, watching Riddle's one hand and the chamber's ceiling and the thing he could feel in the darkness at the base of the statue. "And I'm not my father. I'm something you don't have a category for." Riddle studied him. The red-tinged eyes were intelligent, deeply, extraordinarily intelligent, the intelligence of someone who had spent their entire life as the most capable mind in every room they occupied. "I know what you are," he said. "Divine bloodline. Artemis's get. I've been in Ginny Weasley's head for months, and she carries your reputation in some detail." He tilted his head. "I know about your magic. The silver discharge. The enhanced senses." He smiled, and it was beautiful and cold. I know that the basilisk's gaze can kill even a divine mortal. The eyes don't discriminate. I know that too, Harry said. He'd stopped moving. He was 20 feet from Riddle, which was close enough. That's why I'm not going to look at it. Riddle's smile didn't waver. He spoke, Parseltongue, fluid and commanding, and from the darkness at the base of Slytherin's statue something moved. The sound of it was the sound of the chamber, the mass of it, the age of it, the cold patience of something that had been waiting in the dark for 50 years to be useful again. Harry heard it before he saw it, the particular resonance of something large moving over stone, and he closed his eyes. Not in fear. In strategy. He was in his forest. He was in complete darkness on a night with no moon, tracking something by sound and smell and the texture of the air, the way Artemis had taught him when he was 7, the year she'd said sight is the crutch that makes you lazy, use the rest. He knew where the basilisk was. He knew its size from the vibration, its position from the displacement of air, its speed from the pattern of sound. He raised the bow. The arrow was silver, not metaphorically, not touched, but made, from a material that wasn't quite metal and wasn't quite magic but was both, the bow Artemis had given him and its ammunition a thing of her making, carrying her quality. He waited. He tracked the basilisk by sound, by the pressure wave of its movement, by the smell of old scales and cold and the particular something that was basilisk-specific and matched the entry in the bestiary exactly. He tracked it the way he tracked anything, with patience, with specificity, with the complete absence of hurry. He shot. The arrow found the roof of the basilisk's mouth, it had opened to hiss, to scream, and the arrow went upward and the silver of it hit the brain tissue above the palate and the sound the chamber made was enormous and final, a reverberating crash as something immense went still. Harry opened his eyes. Riddle was staring at the basilisk. At the silver-fletched arrow. At Harry. Interesting, Riddle said, and his voice had finally, for the first time, a quality underneath the control. You killed it blind. Sight is a crutch, Harry said. He dropped the bow to the floor. And you're fading. Ginny's too far gone to sustain you. He could see it, the physical presence of Riddle was less than it had been 60 seconds ago, the edges losing definition, the developing photograph reversing. You don't have long. Riddle raised Ginny's wand. Harry's hand was already up. The silver burst was not a spell in the conventional sense, not a named incantation, not a technique from any textbook, but the same thing he'd used on Quirrell, the same divine presence expressed as force, and it hit the diary on the chamber floor with enough power to drive the stone beneath it an inch deeper into the rock. The diary exploded. Black ink, unnaturally black, black with the specific density of something that had been holding a person's worth of experience for 60 years, erupted outward and Riddle came apart with it, screaming in a voice that carried every octave of Tom Riddle and beyond him Lord Voldemort and beyond him the thing that had been before both, the original hunger, the first refusal, and the chamber echoed it and then swallowed it and then was quiet. The torches burned. Harry walked to Ginny and knelt beside her and pressed 2 fingers to her neck, pulse, strong, the healthy rhythm of someone unconscious and not dying, and then looked at the diary on the floor. Destroyed. A hole through it, pages blackened from the edges, the ink dispersed. He sat back on his heels and looked at the chamber's ceiling. I know, he said, to no one visible. I used too much. I'll be more efficient next time. He had the distinct impression of silver eyes, far above and patient, failing to disagree. Ginny stirred. Her eyes opened, her own eyes, not the red-tinged thing that had been in them for months, and she looked up at Harry with the complete disorientation of someone waking in a place they hadn't chosen. It's done, he said. Can you walk? She tried. She couldn't, quite, so he helped her up and put one arm around her and she leaned on him with the unguarded exhaustion of someone who had nothing left to perform for. I didn't know, she said quietly, walking. I kept writing in it and then I couldn't stop and then I couldn't remember things and it wasn't a diary, Harry said. It was a weapon with a reader attached. He glanced at her. It wasn't your fault. She was quiet for a moment. How are you so calm? I'm not always calm, he said. I'm calm right now because being calm is useful right now. She considered this. That's not very comforting. No, he agreed. But it's true. They walked back through the chamber, past the dead basilisk. She flinched from its size, even dead, and he didn't blame her, and back toward the passage. The torches followed them, lighting their way out. Dumbledore was waiting at the top of the slide. He'd conjured a sort of gentle levitation for Ginny before Harry was even fully out of the tunnel mouth, directing her carefully to the edge of the sink and then wrapping a conjured blanket around her shoulders with the ease of someone who had been managing catastrophes for a very long time. McGonagall was white-faced and doing something that might have been controlled breathing. Lockhart was against the far wall looking like something had restructured his fundamental assumptions about himself, which Harry suspected was true. Ron was the first to Ginny, and the two of them were briefly occupied with a sibling reunion that Harry stepped back from, because some things didn't require witnesses. Dumbledore came to Harry. They stood slightly apart from the others, and Dumbledore looked at Harry with an expression that had moved well past surprise into something Harry didn't have an immediate word for. The old blue eyes moved from Harry's face to the bow over his shoulder to the chamber opening and back. The basilisk, Dumbledore said. Dead, Harry said. The diary. Destroyed. The memory, the fragment of Tom Riddle, gone, Harry said. Dispersed. Not contained, dispersed. There's a difference. Dumbledore nodded slowly. I'm aware, he said, and his voice was very measured, and Harry could hear the thing underneath the measure, the assessment of what this meant for the larger shape of the war, the question of whether other fragments existed, the terrible mathematics of a soul deliberately divided. There are more, Harry said. Fragments. He would have made more than one, that level of obsession doesn't produce singular action. He would have made multiple anchors for himself. The diary is one. Yes, Dumbledore said, and the word cost him something to say. I have suspected as much for some time. I'll need to know about them, Harry said. When you're ready to tell me. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. When I have confirmed what I suspect, he said carefully, I will tell you everything I know. Good, Harry said. Because hunting blind is less efficient than hunting informed. The corner of Dumbledore's mouth moved. It was tired, and it was genuine, and it was the expression of a man who had spent decades carrying very heavy information alone and had just, perhaps, found someone to share the weight with. You know, Dumbledore said quietly, there are very few people to whom I would say this, and fewer still who would hear it as I intend it. He looked at Harry steadily. I am glad you exist, Harry. Genuinely, personally glad. Harry was quiet for a moment. He thought about the mirror, the kitchen table, the afternoon light. He thought about Artemis at the fire saying you will always be mine first. He thought about Mrs. Weasley's hug on the platform and Hermione's voice saying most important information about you I've found yet and Ron saying bring her back with his whole self behind it. Yes, he said. So am I. He walked over to where Ron and Ginny were sitting together against the bathroom wall, Ginny wrapped in the conjured blanket, Ron with his arm around her and his jaw set in the way that said he was going to be fine in a minute but needed one more minute to get there. Harry sat down on the floor beside them with his back to the wall and stretched his legs out and didn't say anything, because nothing needed to be said, and the three of them sat there in the flooded bathroom while the adults organized things around them. Hermione arrived 40 minutes later, with McGonagall and in a state of barely controlled urgency, and took in the scene, Ginny wrapped in a blanket, Harry on the floor, Ron still going, and she looked at Harry with that specific assessing look and said, Are you hurt? No, he said. She sat down on his other side. What happened to the basilisk? I shot it, he said. With my eyes closed. She was quiet for 3 seconds. Of course you did, she said, and there was something in her voice that was exasperation and something that was not. The moon came through the bathroom's high window, small, high, nearly full, and the light of it landed on Harry's hands where they rested on his knees, turning the ordinary silver of his magic to something brighter, something that came from further away and carried more warmth than moonlight usually did. He let it stay there. Around him the castle creaked and settled, full of sleeping students who didn't yet know how close the thing had been, and Dumbledore's voice came from further down the corridor managing the aftermath, and the basilisk lay quiet in the chamber below the school, and the diary's black ink dried to dust on the old stone floor. The hunt had moved forward. Not finished, nowhere near finished, the larger shape of it still gathering itself in the dark of the future, but forward. One more, he thought. And then whatever comes after. The moon held steady in the window, and the light didn't waver. Chapter 5, The Wolf and the Stag. The summer before third year arrived with the specific weight of something that had been building for a while and was finally ready to land. Harry was in the forest when Artemis told him about Sirius Black. Not gently, she didn't do things gently, and Harry had long since stopped expecting it, but thoroughly, the way she told him anything that mattered, directly, with full information, without softening the edges. They were deep in the old growth, the kind of forest where the trees were so old they had opinions, and she was moving through it with the effortless quiet that was her native state, and Harry kept pace beside her the way he'd been doing since he could walk. "Your father had 3 close friends," she said, without preamble, because preamble was for people who needed working up to things. "Remus Lupin, Peter Pettigrew, and Sirius Black. The 4 of them were," she paused, which she rarely did, "they were the kind of friendship that shapes a person. The deep kind." "I know about them," Harry said. "The Marauders. I found references in some of the older Hogwarts records." "Then you know Sirius was accused of betraying your father to Voldemort," she said. "And killing 13 people with a single curse. And that he's been in Azkaban for 12 years. "Yes. He escaped last week," she said. Harry was quiet for 3 steps. "How?" "No one knows. Azkaban has never had an escape. The Dementors," her voice carried the specific quality it always carried when discussing things that predated the current magical world order and were not improved by the comparison, "are creatures of profound cold. They destroy hope and memory and the will to exist. No human being has ever maintained enough of themselves in Azkaban to plan an escape, let alone execute one." She glanced at him. "Sirius Black apparently did. Which means he's either considerably more capable than the Ministry has given him credit for," Harry said, "or he had help, or both. Or he's exactly what he was accused of being," Artemis said, "and the thing that sustained him through 12 years of Dementors was the desire to finish what Voldemort started." Harry thought about this. He thought about it the way she had taught him to think about complex information, not jumping to the first conclusion that was emotionally satisfying, but holding the possibilities open, running them, feeling for the weight of each one. "He's coming to Hogwarts," Harry said. It wasn't a question. "The Ministry believes he is. They've requested permission to station Dementors at the school as a protective measure." Her jaw tightened. Dumbledore agreed, with conditions. "Dementors at Hogwarts," Harry said flatly. "I know. I know, Harry." He walked in silence for a moment. The trees around them were old enough that their root systems crossed and recrossed under the earth, a whole underground conversation going on in the dark below them. "What do you think?" he said. "About Sirius. Do you think he did it?" She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that they came through a section of dense undergrowth and out into a clearing where the moonlight fell straight down and the grass was silver with it. She stopped there, in the center of the clearing, and looked up at the moon. "I think," she said slowly, "that you should find out for yourself. I have impressions. Things I felt about the night at Godric's Hollow that I have never fully explained to you because they were impressions only, not knowledge." She looked at him. "But I think this is yours to discover. The truth about your father's friends is part of the truth about your father, and that belongs to you." He nodded. "Be careful of the Dementors," she said. "Not because they can touch the divine in you, they can't reach that, but because the human part of you carries memory, and some memories become weapons in the wrong hands. He knew she meant the specific memory, the one that lived in the part of him that was James Potter's son, the fragment of sound he carried that he'd never spoken of to anyone. A woman's voice, frightened and fierce, in the last moment before something ended. He'd never known whose voice it was. He'd assumed. Standing in the moonlit clearing, he thought maybe he was beginning to understand. The Hogwarts Express on September 1st carried, this year, a particular tension layered under the usual noise, students who'd read about Sirius Black in The Prophet all summer, parents who'd had opinions about the Dementors at the station, a general current of anxiety that Harry moved through like water, noting it, unaffected by it, storing the patterns. Hermione had, predictably, a new timetable that appeared physically impossible. Harry looked at it on the train and handed it back to her without comment. She had the expression of someone who'd heard several opinions about it already. "It's manageable," she said. "I know it is," he said. "For you specifically." She looked at him. "You're not going to tell me it's too many classes?" "You know how many classes you can handle," he said. "I'm not going to tell you things you already know." She looked at him for a moment with that particular expression, the one that appeared when he did something that she was categorizing under unexpected but consistent, and went back to her book. Ron had new chess pieces, a gift from his father, and spent the first half hour of the journey explaining the history of each one in detail that suggested he'd researched them over the summer, which Harry found both endearing and slightly concerning in terms of Ron's summer priorities. The compartment door opened halfway through Scotland, and the man who came in was asleep before they'd processed who he was, dropping into the corner seat with the immediate unconsciousness of someone who'd been running on insufficient rest for an extended period, his traveling cloak worn at the elbows, the lines in his face deeper than his apparent age accounted for. Remus Lupin. Harry knew the name the moment he saw the face, not because he'd met him, but because he'd spent enough time with the few photographs that existed of the Marauders to know who the Quiet One was. The one who always stood slightly apart in the images, slightly separate, with the contained quality of someone managing something private. He looked at Lupin's sleeping face for a long moment. Sick. Harry could tell that immediately, not a current illness but something chronic, something that ran in the bone, the specific quality of a body working hard to maintain ordinary function. The pallor wasn't the pallor of someone coming off a cold. It was the pallor of someone who had a recurring cost they paid regularly and had learned to budget for it. Werewolf, he thought, with the calm recognition of someone who had met enough of them in the forest to recognize the markers. In human form, healthy between transformations, but always carrying it. He looked at the chocolate in his bag, Honeydukes, which he'd picked up at King's Cross because the chocolate was better than anything you could make, and he developed preferences, and set a piece on the seat beside Lupin without waking him. Hermione watched him do this and didn't say anything, which meant she'd reached the same conclusion and was filing it the same way. The Dementors came at the border of the school's grounds, which was where the Ministry had apparently decided they needed to be. The train slowed and the lights went out and the cold came in, not weather cold but the specific cold of something that consumed warmth as a matter of its nature, an organized absence of everything that made a space habitable. Harry felt it the way you felt a change in air pressure, a full-body awareness. And then the memory. It came without warning the way it always came, except this time it was louder than it had ever been, the voice he'd carried for as long as he could remember, the frightened fierce woman's voice that he'd always heard at the edge of things. And this time it wasn't at the edge. This time it was the whole room, the whole moment, the Dementor pulling it forward with the particular appetite of creatures that fed on the good things in people. "Not Harry, please, not Harry, I'll do anything, take me instead." He'd thought, he'd assumed, that the voice belonged to Lily Potter. It was always what he'd thought, because who else would it be, the woman who died for him. But now, standing in the cold of the Dementor's passing, he heard something he hadn't been listening for before. The quality of the voice. The specific quality. It wasn't grief in the voice. It wasn't the bargaining of someone who had already understood that they were going to die. It was the fierce bright refusal of someone who was still fighting, who had made a choice that was not resignation but defiance, not sacrifice but combat. Take me instead not as surrender but as a weapon aimed at the thing attacking her child. The Dementor passed. The cold receded. The lights came back. Harry was standing. He didn't remember standing. He was on his feet in the middle of the compartment, wand in his hand, silver light bright at his fingers, and the Dementor was gone but the silver was still there, his magic responding to threat the way it always did, immediate and without ceremony. Lupin was awake. He was looking at Harry with an expression that had several layers moving through it simultaneously. Something professional, he was clearly already mentally shifting into the role of teacher, and something more personal, a thing that moved through his eyes when he looked at Harry's face that was grief made quickly controlled. Chocolate, Lupin said, and his voice was exactly as Harry had imagined it, measured, warm, used to making things calm. He produced a bar from his bag and broke it and held it out. Eat. It helps. I know, Harry said, sitting down. He took the chocolate because it was offered without condescension and ate it, and felt the warmth come back through him in the specific way that Lupin had clearly observed before. You remained standing, Lupin said. Through the full passage. Yes. Lupin looked at him carefully. Most people, even experienced witches and wizards, can't manage that. The Dementor's effect is generally, it didn't knock me down, Harry said. It reached something. But it didn't knock me down. Lupin absorbed this. He was looking at Harry with the measuring quality of a teacher, and something else, the personal layer, moving underneath. You look very like your father, he said finally. Quietly. Like something said to itself as much as to the room. I know, Harry said. James was my friend, Lupin said. A very good friend. The past tense sat in the compartment with them for a moment. I'm going to be your defense against the dark arts professor this year. I know, Harry said again. Lupin blinked. You knew. I recognized you. He met Lupin's eyes directly. I know who you are, Professor. I know who you were. Something moved in Lupin's face, the controlled grief again, and under it something that was almost relief, the relief of someone for whom a particular weight has been acknowledged rather than avoided. Then, he said carefully, you know I was friends with your father. And with Sirius Black. Yes, Harry said. The compartment was quiet. Ron was looking between them with good instincts running, not interrupting. Hermione had put her book down. Professor, Harry said, and his voice was completely level, do you think he did it? Betrayed my father? Lupin's face did a very complicated thing very quietly. He looked at Harry for a long moment, the kind of look that was deciding something, the kind that was choosing between careful and true. No, he said. I have never believed it. He stopped. But my belief is not, I have no proof. I have only my knowledge of who Sirius was. Who he was to James. That's enough to start with, Harry said. We can work from there. Lupin looked at him. The layers in his expression settled into something that was primarily and genuinely stunned. You're remarkably, he stopped. Started again. James would have charged and armed. He would have been angry and he would have been magnificent and he would have gotten into trouble almost immediately. I know, Harry said. I'm not him. No, Lupin said softly. You are something quite your own. The train ran on through the dark, and the Dementor stayed at the border, and Harry ate the rest of the chocolate and thought about the voice, and what it meant that he understood it differently now, and what he was going to do with that understanding. Lupin was, without question, the best teacher at Hogwarts. Not because he was the most academically brilliant, Snape's technical knowledge surpassed his in specific areas, McGonagall's mastery of transfiguration was in a different category, but because he taught the way people learned, which was through doing things and being shown why the things mattered. The first lesson with the boggart was the proof of it, the entire class learning to face the thing that frightened them most, the specific mechanism of courage, the ridiculous that worked not because of the incantation but because of what the incantation required you to do in the split second before you spoke it, Harry was last in the queue. When it came to him, the boggart moved from the thing it had been for the previous student, and Harry stood and watched it decide. It shifted, the way boggarts shifted, that liquid formless quality as they pulled the fear shape from you, and went still. It had chosen the form of a Dementor. The class went quiet. The boggart Dementor was the full version, the cold and the dark and the sound of wings, and Harry looked at it and heard the voice again, briefly, the woman's voice fierce and bright and refusing. Then he thought about what was genuinely funny about a Dementor, which was not, on the surface, obvious. He thought about the Dementor having the shape of the thing it was afraid of, itself, reflected, the great cold predator encountering something it couldn't reach. He thought about what a Dementor would look like if it encountered something it couldn't feed on and had to confront the fact that its entire operating model had just failed. He thought about what Artemis would look like face to face with a Dementor. He cast the ridiculous with a silver burst that was more than the standard charm, and the boggart Dementor became, for one absolutely perfect second, the shape of a cold hooded creature sitting on a bench being completely ignored by a silver-eyed woman who was cleaning an arrow with absolutely no acknowledgement of its existence. The class lost their minds. Even Lupin laughed, which was clearly genuine. After class, walking out, Lupin stopped Harry with a quiet word and closed the door on the others. He was smiling, but there was something under the smile that was working through something. "That image," Lupin said. "It was funny," Harry said. "Yes." He looked at Harry carefully. "The woman in the image, my mother," Harry said simply. Lupin was quiet for a moment. I knew she was extraordinary," he said. "From the night at Godric's Hollow. From what little," he stopped. "I always wondered why the curse rebounded. Dumbledore said it was Lily's sacrifice, and I believed him because, well, what else was there to believe?" He looked at Harry. "But it was more than that." "Yes," Harry said. Lupin seemed to be choosing his words with the care of a man walking across uncertain ground. "Your mother's sacrifice was real," he said. "Lily Potter was, she was extraordinary in her own right, and what she did that night was genuine and it mattered. But the thing the curse hit when it rebounded," he met Harry's eyes, "that was already there. Before Voldemort arrived." "Yes," Harry said again. Lupin breathed out slowly. "I want to ask you about something," he said. "And I want you to know that whatever you tell me, or don't tell me, I'm going to be honest with you in return." "All right," Harry said. "The voice," Lupin said. "When the Dementors came on the train. You heard something." Harry looked at him. "I heard it on your face," Lupin said, gently. "The same way I hear certain things. The involuntary recognition." "A woman's voice," Harry said. "I've always heard it near Dementors. I always assumed it was Lily Potter." "Is that still what you assume?" He was quiet for a moment. "The voice sounds like someone who chose to fight," he said. "Not like someone who had run out of options." He looked at Lupin steadily. "That's not a complaint. Both things are courage. But they're different kinds." Lupin was very still. "Was Lily Potter the kind of person who fought until there was nothing left to fight with," Harry said, "or the kind of person who chose the option that cost the most?" "Both," Lupin said, after a moment. "She was, both." His voice was careful, the care of someone holding something breakable. "She didn't surrender, Harry. She offered herself as an alternative because she'd already assessed the other options and found them insufficient. That's not resignation. That was Lily. She did the math and she chose the answer that protected you." Harry thought about this for a long time in the silence of the empty classroom. "Thank you," he said finally. Lupin nodded. He looked old, for a moment, in the specific way of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has just set a small part of it down. Sirius Black appeared in October, in the way that things with genuine menace appeared, not with fanfare, not with the dramatic entrance that the Prophet's coverage had somehow made you expect, but quietly, in a place that should have been secure. Harry found him in Gryffindor Tower. Not because he'd been looking, though he was always looking, in the general sense that his attention was always running, but because he'd come back from a late library session and taken the shortcut through the 7th floor and heard the sound on the stairs below him. Not footsteps. Something else. The specific quality of breathing that belonged to someone who had been moving very quietly for a very long time and had just, briefly, stopped. He went still on the stairs. He went so still that the staircase didn't creak under his weight, a skill that had taken him until age 9 to develop properly. Below him, in the dark of the staircase, something shifted. He reached out with his senses, not his wand, not his magic, but the older thing, the sensory capability Artemis had honed since before he could articulate what it was doing. Height, weight, the smell that came with extended time in enclosed spaces without adequate care, and under that something animal and enormous, not present but residual, the smell of transformation, of a body that changed its own fundamental nature on a regular schedule. Animagus. He'd read about them. The smell was different from a werewolf, voluntary versus involuntary, the chemical difference between chosen and imposed transformation. And beneath the animagus residue, the smell of a person who had been in Azkaban long enough for the Dementors to have taken most of what they could take, leaving behind the stripped-down essential self. And also something else. Something that didn't match the narrative. The smell of grief was specific. Harry knew it from animals, from the forest, from the way a wolf moved differently in the days after it lost a packmate. The grief coming off the shape below him on the stairs was old and clean, not the festering grief of someone who had done something unforgivable and couldn't leave it, but the worn smooth grief of someone who had been carrying a loss for 12 years and had made peace with none of it. He was not, Harry thought with the cold clarity of a tracker reading a scene, smelling a guilty man. Sirius Black, he said, quietly, in the dark. The shape below went completely still. I know you're there, Harry said. I could hear you breathing from the 7th floor. A long silence. Then, from the dark below, a voice that was rough with disuse and something that was trying to be controlled, Harry. Just that. Just his name. In the voice of someone who had been waiting to say it for 12 years. Harry came down the stairs and stood at the landing and looked at the man who emerged from the shadow into the dim light of a nearby torch. Sirius Black he was not what the prophet photographs had prepared him for. The photographs showed a hollowed madman, the eyes empty, the face of someone the Dementors had largely finished with. The person standing in the torchlight was gaunt, was damaged in the specific ways of 12 years of Azkaban, but the eyes were anything but empty. They were James Potter's best friend's eyes, and they were looking at Harry's face with an expression that had too many things in it to be named individually. You should know, Harry said, standing one landing above Sirius, his wand in his hand but pointed at the floor, that I can hear grief. The way it smells. The difference between the grief of someone who did something and the grief of someone who lost everything. Sirius said nothing. And I should know, Harry continued, whether you were my father's secret keeper before I do anything else. I wasn't, Sirius said. His voice was rough but the words were completely clear, the clarity of someone saying something they've said to themselves 10,000 times in the dark. Peter was. We switched. James agreed. We thought I was the obvious choice, the one Voldemort would go after, so we switched to Peter as a misdirect. He stopped. Peter betrayed them. I went after him. He blew up the street, killed 12 muggles, cut off his own finger, and faked his own death, and I was arrested for all of it. Harry looked at him for a long time. Where is Peter Pettigrew now? He said. Sirius's jaw tightened. Here, he said. At Hogwarts. He's been here for years. His eyes moved. Your friend, the Weasley boy. His rat. Harry went very still. Not with surprise, he was past the age where surprises knocked him sideways, but with the particular stillness of a hunter who has just understood the full shape of the terrain. Ron's rat. The rat that had been in the Weasley family for 12 years, that was old beyond what rats were supposed to be, that Harry had looked at once and found faintly wrong in the way that things were wrong when they weren't what they claimed. "Scabbers," Harry said. "Peter Pettigrew," Sirius said. Hiding in animal form, waiting for Voldemort to return, positioned perfectly to, he stopped. His hands, Harry noticed, were shaking slightly. Not with fear. With fury held so long it had become indistinguishable from the body. "I escaped Azkaban for one reason," Sirius said. "I saw his photograph in the Prophet. With your friend and his family. And I knew. I knew what he was doing there." "You came to kill him," Harry said. "I came to finish what I should have finished 12 years ago," Sirius said. "Before he could get to you." Harry looked at him. "He's not going to get to me," he said, mildly. Sirius blinked. Something shifted in his expression, the recalibration that Harry had watched adults do, the moment when the story they'd constructed about Harry Potter, the endangered child, encountered the reality in front of them. I know what I am," Harry said. "And I know what I need." He paused. "I need Peter Pettigrew alive. Not dead, alive, because alive he can be taken to the Ministry and he can confess and you can be cleared." He held Sirius's eyes. 12 years. Can you wait one more night for justice?" The torchlight moved on Sirius's face. The gauntness, the damage, and beneath it the person who had been James Potter's best friend and had been broken almost entirely and had refused to stop. Something in his expression moved through the grief and the fury to a place that was very old and very young at the same time. "You sound like him," Sirius said quietly. "Not in your voice. Not in your face, you look like him, but you don't sound like him. You sound," he stopped. "You sound like what he would have become. If he'd had another stop. You're what he would have been proud of." Harry felt something in his chest that had no clean name. "Come with me," he said, after a moment. "There's a professor here who should be part of this conversation." Lupin opened his office door at Harry's knock, took one look at the hallway, and went completely still. Harry stood to one side. Behind him, Sirius. The two men looked at each other across the threshold of the office doorway, 12 years of silence and grief and distance and the particular wreckage of a friendship that had been broken by what had happened and was now standing in a doorway in the middle of the night looking at each other. "Sirius," Lupin said. His voice was not quite steady. "Moony," Sirius said, and his voice was worse. Harry stepped aside and Sirius came in and the two of them stood in the center of the office for a moment with the weight of 12 years between them, and Harry closed the door quietly and sat in the chair by the fire and said, "Peter is Scabbers. The Weasley family rat. I'll need to retrieve him, carefully, and we need Pettigrew's confession before we take this to the Ministry." The two men looked at him. "Tonight," Harry said. "Before he figures out what's happening and runs." Lupin gathered himself with the skill of someone who had been managing impossible situations for most of his adult life. "You knew," he said to Harry. "When you came to my office about your father's friends. You were all ready." "I had strong suspicions," Harry said. "Strong enough." He looked at Sirius. "Sit down. You look like you're about to fall over." Sirius laughed, which came out rough and real and startled, as though he'd surprised himself. He sat. Lupin conjured tea with the automatic competence of a person for whom tea was a response to almost any situation, and the three of them sat in the small office while Harry laid out the plan with the methodical clarity that was, by this point, simply how he organized things. Ron, he said, needed to know first. It was his rat, and he'd had it for years, and he deserved to know the truth rather than having it happen to him. Hermione second, because she would be useful in the execution and furious if left out. Pettigrew needed to be cornered somewhere with no easy exits and no opportunity to use the missing finger as a fake death, which meant the grounds rather than the castle. The Ministry contact needed to be someone Dumbledore trusted rather than someone Fudge trusted, which was a significant distinction. "You've thought about this," Sirius said. "Since October," Harry said. "It's November." I know. I was making sure I had everything right before I moved. He looked at Sirius steadily. I've been watching Scabbers for weeks. He's getting agitated, something's shifted, whether it's your presence in the castle or something else. We don't have much more time before he runs. Sirius had the expression of someone encountering something they would previously have called impossible, Harry, specifically, the fact of Harry. He kept looking at him with the accumulated weight of 12 years of imagining and the reality that didn't match any of it. I'm sorry, Sirius said, abruptly, to Harry. For what? For not being there. He stopped. His voice was rough. I was your godfather. I was supposed to, James and Lily made me your godfather and then everything went wrong and you were just, I didn't even know where you were, no one knew where you were, and I couldn't, you were in Azkaban, Harry said. That's a sufficient explanation. I could have fought harder. Before I went in. I was so sure Peter was dead and James was dead and everything was, I just let them take me. Harry looked at him. The gaunt face, the damaged eyes, the person who had been trying to function under 12 years of Dementor exposure and had kept the core of himself intact by what must have been sheer bloody-minded refusal. Sirius, he said. Yes. I had a good mother, Harry said. She was extraordinary, and she raised me well, and I'm not damaged by your absence in the way you're afraid I am. He paused. But I would like, if it's possible, to know the living person who knew my father best. He held the gray eyes. So let's deal with Peter first. And then we'll have time for everything else. The fire cracked in the grate. Lupin had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that was listening so hard it had stopped making ambient noise. All right, Sirius said. His voice had changed. Steadied, slightly. The direction of a purpose clarifying. Tell me the plan. The Whomping Willow was Lupin's idea, specifically the knot at the base that froze the branches when pressed, which he knew from long experience with a route that had been installed for his specific use in his student years. They went at midnight, Harry, Hermione, Ron, Lupin, and Sirius in the form of a large black dog that moved through the castle's shadows with the easy practice of someone who had been an animagus since his 6th year. Ron had been, it had taken Harry 10 minutes to explain the situation to him, and Ron's face had gone through approximately 40 expressions, and he'd held Scabbers in his hands and looked at the rat and said, very quietly, how long have you known? And Harry had said, October, and Ron had looked at the rat for another long moment and put it in his pocket and said, right. Let's go. Hermione had been told the summary version on the walk down and had said, I want the full account later, and, what's the plan, simultaneously, which was efficient. The passage under the Whomping Willow was narrow and damp and long and opened into the Shrieking Shack, which was neither shrieking nor particularly sinister in the presence of actual intent. Harry stood in the middle of it and looked around at the damaged furniture and thought about what this place was for, built for a werewolf boy to transform safely, away from people who could be hurt. Built by a school that decided a child who wasn't responsible for what he was deserved protection anyway. He thought about Lupin, walking in through the door behind him, looking at the room with the expression of someone who had complicated feelings about a place that had been both prison and sanctuary. Peter Pettigrew, Scabbers, was in Ron's pocket. They brought him out. Sirius transformed back, which was something to witness, the large black dog becoming a gaunt man in damaged robes with the particular fluidity of someone for whom the transformation was as natural as walking. Lupin moved to stand on Pettigrew's other side with the stillness of someone who had decided exactly what they were going to do and had no intention of wavering. Pettigrew was small and pale and terrified, which was its own kind of information. He looked at Sirius and he looked at Harry and something moved through his eyes that was not the reaction of an innocent man. He was trying, Harry could see, to calculate, to find the exit, the angle, the story that would serve. The eyes moved to Lupin, to Hermione, to Ron, assessing and discarding. Harry stepped forward. Peter Pettigrew, he said, pleasantly. You've had quite a long retirement. Pettigrew's eyes found his and skittered away immediately, the involuntary flinch of small animals encountering large predators. I don't know what, who are you? This is all Sirius is mad, he's escaped from Azkaban and you're going to confess, Harry said. To the Ministry. I don't know what you're. Harry crouched down in front of him, putting himself at eye level with the man sitting against the shrieking shack wall, and looked at him with the full quality of his attention. Not threatening. Not aggressive. Simply complete, the kind of attention that made it clear that every exit had been considered and found closed, that every calculation had been run and found insufficient. You betrayed my father, Harry said quietly, to a man who went to his house and killed him. You let Sirius Black spend 12 years in Azkaban for something you did. You cut off your own finger, killed 12 people, and hid in animal form inside the home of a family with children for over a decade. He paused. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to give you exactly one opportunity to choose to tell the truth, and whether or not you take it, the truth is going to come out. You can't prove the missing finger, Hermione said, from behind Harry, holding up a piece of parchment with a precision that was impressive even under pressure. Pettigrew's death was confirmed by that evidence. But the body was never identified beyond that single piece. Contemporary magical forensic standards would not accept that identification today. She looked at him. A truth serum examination before the Wizengamot would take approximately 20 minutes and your entire story would be in the public record by morning. Pettigrew looked at her. He looked at Sirius. He looked at Lupin, who was watching him with an expression that wasn't hatred, something much harder, which was the clear-eyed assessment of someone who had made peace with what they were seeing. And then something happened to Pettigrew's face, the calculation flickering, the angles not resolving, and under the calculation something very human and very miserable, the face of a person who had been afraid for so long that the fear had become indistinguishable from the self. He would have killed me, Pettigrew said, and his voice cracked. If I'd refused. He would have. You don't know what he was, you can't know, he was. Others refused, Sirius said, and his voice was flat and level and carried 12 years behind every word. The Longbottoms refused. The Potters refused. People who could have saved themselves chose not to. I wasn't brave enough, Pettigrew said, and it was so plainly, miserably true that the room went quiet with it. I was never brave enough. I knew it, James knew it, you all knew it, and I panicked, and then there was no going back, and then he was gone and I thought it was over and I could just disappear. I thought it was over. It wasn't over, Harry said. And now you're going to fix the part of it that can be fixed. Pettigrew looked at him. The watery eyes, the trembling hands, the face of a man who had spent decades running from something and had just been caught not by force but by the simple fact of being seen completely. Will you, he started. Stopped. Will you tell them, will you say that there was, I'll tell them that you confessed voluntarily, Harry said. That's true. It's happening right now. He held the small man's eyes. That's all I can offer you. But it's real. Pettigrew broke, and confessed, and Sirius listened with his hands very still, and Lupin wrote it down with the dictaquil that Hermione had thought to bring, and Harry stood and listened to the account of the night his father died from the person who had caused it, and he held the anger that came with it the way Artemis had taught him to hold things that were too large for the moment, carefully, with intention, for later. The ministry process was not fast. It was ministry. Dumbledore was involved before dawn, and the Wizengamot convened within a week, and the Veritaserum examination confirmed everything, and Sirius Black was released from the charge of murder and awarded compensation that no amount of gold could actually compensate for. Peter Pettigrew was sentenced to Azkaban, where he would presumably be miserable in ways that Harry found he had no particular interest in dwelling on. Lupin resigned, which Harry had not anticipated and which hit with the specific force of something you'd allowed yourself not to prepare for. It came out about the werewolf status, which had apparently been an open secret in the staff room but became less manageable once students knew, because there were always parents. Harry stood in Lupin's office the day after the resignation was announced, which had been arranged to look like a mutual decision but was clearly not, and looked at the packed boxes. You didn't have to resign, he said. It was the right it was the politically convenient, Harry said. Which is different. Lupin looked at him. The parents of students have legitimate concerns, some of them have legitimate concerns, Harry said. And some of them have prejudice dressed as concern. Those are different things and you know it. He paused. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you that you are the best defense teacher this school has had in at least a decade, and the students you're leaving have less because you're going. Lupin was quiet for a long moment. You're angry, he said, with something like surprise. Yes, Harry said. I'm allowed to be. You are, Lupin agreed. He looked at the packed boxes. I'll write, he said. If that's, I'd like to write. Yes, Harry said. And next year, if Dumbledore has the sense to ask you back, he won't, Lupin said, with the calm of someone who had made peace with a thing. But thank you, Harry. They shook hands, which turned into something else, an actual embrace, brief and real, the kind that happened when two people had been through enough together that the formal version stopped making sense. Lupin held on for one moment and let go, and Harry looked at the room one last time, the maps of dark creatures on the walls, the office that had felt, for 1 year, like a place where the information was honest, and left. He went to find Sirius. Sirius was on the grounds, in the afternoon light, which was the first afternoon light of genuine freedom in 12 years, and he was sitting with his back against the wall of the Ollery looking at the sky with the expression of someone still learning to trust that it would stay there. He looked up when Harry came and something in his face softened. Lupin gone, he said. Yes, Harry said. He sat down beside him against the wall. The sky above was September clear, the kind of blue that felt temporary. He'll be all right, Sirius said. Remus always, he always finds a way through. He's had practice. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Harry said, Tell me about my father. The real version, not the legend. The actual person. Sirius looked at him sideways. And then he started talking, and it was the first time anyone had talked to Harry about James Potter as a person rather than a symbol or a loss or a warning, and the afternoon went long and the shadows changed and Harry sat against the Ollery wall and listened to his father come alive in someone else's memory. James Potter, who had been arrogant at 15 and magnificent at 17 and different at 20 in ways that Sirius described with the specific grief of someone who had watched a person become their best self and then not had enough time. Who had loved Lily Evans with the absolute conviction of someone who had finally understood what they wanted and had decided to be worth it. Who had been brilliant and reckless and funny and brave and who had made mistakes and fixed them and made more and had lived, according to Sirius, at a consistent pitch of full intensity that had made everything around him slightly more vivid. He was real, Harry said, when Sirius had been quiet for a moment. Very, Sirius said. That's what I needed to know, Harry said. Not that he was perfect. That he was real. Sirius looked at him with the eyes of someone feeling something enormous and not having a word for it. You're going to be all right, he said. Whatever comes next, he stopped. Tried again. You're going to be more than all right. Yes, Harry said. I know. The moon came up early that evening, as it sometimes did in autumn, visible before full dark, a pale disk in the blue sky above the castle. Harry looked at it for a moment. He thought about Artemis, in the forest, handing him the bow. He thought about Lupin's office, the honest maps on the walls. He thought about Ron's face holding Scabbers and deciding. About Hermione at the fire riddle saying you go forward. About the voice in the dark that he understood differently now, not surrender but defiance, not loss but choice, a woman he'd never met who had chosen the answer that cost the most because the math had said it was right. He thought about his father, real and full and vivid, alive in one person's memory and in the shape of the scar on his forehead and the green of his eyes. He thought about what was coming, the larger shape of the hunt, the things Dumbledore hadn't told him yet, the fragments of a divided soul scattered through the world, the war that wasn't finished building itself toward the moment it would have to be. He felt, clearly and completely, the compass needle pull. Not yet, he thought. But soon. The moon held steady above the castle, silver and patient, and Harry held steady beneath it, and the evening came down around them like something settling into place.